Hello. Okay. Hi again. Sorry. I started the stream late again. Sometimes I'm really good at getting ready for going live really quickly, and then other times it takes a lot longer, so I'll try to. Lateness is one of my flaws that have been working on. But anyways, thank you for tolerating that for now. But I'm here. And I've been planning this for 2 weeks now. And this might end up being more of a philosophy stream than a theology stream, but theology is probably going to still be involved. So the past day or so I've been reading and looking into free will stuff. So we're going to watch a debate about free will. And then maybe another video depending on how fast this goes. So first I'm going to... Hey Harry, how are you? Welcome. Thanks for being here. Okay, so I'm going to practice reading a little bit. Well, not reading, but reading out loud on a live, because I did so bad during my debate with Rachel Wilson reading. Sure. And I wrote down some ideas I have about free will today. So I'm going to read them. And then see if anything changes as we watch these debates. Actually, hold on.
No, we're probably gonna have to.
Okay. Yep. I'm actually gonna show it on the screen. So let me add another thingy majigger. Oh. Okay. I'm not reading all of this. I'm just going to read the bottom portion. My thoughts. And thank you, Harry, for some of the recommendations. I was already on my next thing was going to be looking into free will debates and stuff. And then you gave me some terms, so I started with determinism, and then I went from there. Okay, so this is what I have. You can't really see me, but whatever. Okay, so okay. Wait, I can't read it now. Okay. Determinism. Hold on, maybe I'll start. Okay, no, I have to start from the beginning. Okay. Determinism says we as people have no real choice, and that our decisions and actions are predetermined by uncontrollable desires, fears, biology, and other various external factors. This is a very baby. This is just me right now, my thoughts in the very beginning, reading and stuff. Free will rather claims we as humans are free to make decisions and take actions despite prior instances and past experiences. If we could go back in time, we would have the will to choose, decide, or act differently. So, compatibilism believes both determinism and free will are compatible and both can exist together. It is true our choices, decisions, and actions are restricted by external factors such as biology. Yet those factors are just that, a factor into the equation of choice. Though it is true that some aspects of our lives are completely limited and beyond the ranges of true free will. For example, I cannot will myself to grow wings and fly, but I can build an airplane and freely fly the airplane, admittedly within the confines of law, regulations, and of course physics. But permitting I have access to the financials and materials to build a plane, I can choose to do so. Nonetheless, despite the restraints of biology, physics, genetics, etc., on a good portion of our abilities to will our actions, etc., a good portion of our abilities to will our actions and decisions freely. Okay, that's not a complete sentence. Anyways, I argue that compared to all other life on this planet, we have much more freedom in willing these actions than they do. Animal and plant life act largely off instinct. Animals are far more predictable than humans due to this fact. Wild animals are, of course, still wild and can be unpredictable and dangerous if one is unfamiliar with that particular animal. But if studied, it can be easier to at least determine what their behaviors mean and therefore help predict the temperament of the animal and what they are likely or unlikely to do next based on these instinctual behavioral patterns. Okay, and this part in purple is what I added into this after watching the video we're about to watch. I believe part of the reason humans get so much joy from domesticated animals is because they seemingly act outside of their nature when they act in such ways like showing trust in their owners or deciding to come lay down next to us or come when we call their name. It appears to us as the animal making a conscious decision to trust us, spend time with us, follow our direction, etc. These actions obviously highly differ from humans. We expect humans to cooperate because we live in a civilized society, and we have the choice to do so, and doing so typically or ideally is better for the good of the community. Animals do not obtain the same responsibility humans do. We do not blame animals for their actions because they do not have the free will to choose not to. Animals act on instinct, making them far more predictable than humans. Humans, on the other hand, have a multitude of choices to make, including to willingly and intentionally deceive, trick, and manipulate others, making them far less predictable. Therefore, I believe determinism and free will are compatible. Humans can maintain free will while also having certain biological, physical, and other external factors restrict and limit our ultimate freedom of choice and action. I view these factors to influence our choices and actions, not predetermine them. They influence the likelihood of our willingness to choose one action or outcome over another, but they do not completely dictate the decision. The responsibility still lies within us. The responsibility has come from evolution and knowledge, and while some knowledge has ultimately led us to remove certain responsibilities from certain people for certain reasons, in other cases, newfound knowledge can also explain why we can be held responsible for many of our own actions and decisions. So although there are many predetermined factors that ultimately do factor into and influence our decision making, in many cases, but not all, we are still left with a choice to make, and these external factors merely factor into the likeliness of making that choice or not. In many aspects of life, it is ultimately up to you whether or not you want to go against the grain or fall in line, whichever those choices might be. Okay, yeah, no, I don't know. Hi, welcome from Norway.
I got 2 kills with 27 damage.
Okay, so yeah, I don't know what it is. There's like one person watching, and I'm still nervous when I'm reading pre-written text. It's not even like nervous. I just I don't know. I don't like presentations maybe or something. I don't know. So I have to get better at practicing reading in front of an audience. Sorry, my hair's not dry yet. It bothers the shit out of me when it's like half wet. Alright, so anyways, we can start this video now. As I said, I wrote most of that except for like the purple lines. I I wrote everything in white text before watching this debate, and then I added the purple lines after watching this. And then the second video, if we get to it, I haven't watched yet, so there's actually a couple options, so we'll see. But for now, we're going to start with, it is a debate between Daniel Dennet and Robert Sapolsky. And this is kind of interesting because I think usually it seems to be that the atheists yeah, I don't know. It's weird because like I used to like being on stage as a kid. I was such an extrovert. I loved being the star of the show. I was always such a weirdo, like doing extra things to like stand out. And I was in church plays. And I was a singer. I was a dancer. I did recitals. I played in a band. I did all this stuff, and I loved it. And then, but when it comes to like presentations, like I don't know. I don't know what it is. But anyways, yeah. Hopefully, with time, it will get better. But anyways, so yeah, I think usually the free will people tend to be, okay, so also this is something I want to explore as we're going through this tonight. So it seems that the theist people, the people who like believe in God and stuff, tend to be free will people. And then, like, the atheists tend to be determinism people, which is kind of odd for me because I usually agree with the atheists, even though I'm not an atheist. But, so I found myself in an interesting place here. And I want to explore the idea of why I don't think you need God to have free will, because I don't think that's true at all. So don't think about people watching. Just try and be yourself and talk about stuff you find fun. The most important thing, to have fun on streams. Yeah, no, like the actual streaming isn't as bad. It's just when I'm reading something I already wrote out, like a presentation, for some reason I have a harder time. But thank you for the advice, and welcome again. Okay, so let's just get right into this now.
Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the How To Academy. My name is David Malone. And thank you very much for choosing to join us for tonight's debate about free will. And if I could point out the obvious in a debate like this, it may be, of course, that you didn't choose of your own free will to join this debate. It may be, in fact, that you had no choice in the matter at all. To help us decide whether you did or didn't choose to join us, we have two fantastic speakers this evening. Robert Sapolsky is a professor of biology and neurology at Stanford University, a recipient of the MacArthur Foundation Genius Grant. I think the name is self-explanatory. And he's written a new book called Determined, Life Without Free Will. Joining him, we have one of the world's most influential philosophers, Dan Dennett. He's emeritus professor of philosophy at Tufts University. He's written extensively about the workings of the mind, about consciousness, and has also written about free will. And he too has a new book called I've Been Thinking. And amongst other things we're going to discuss this evening will be determinism. What is it? Free will. Do we have it? And even if we do, is it what we thought it was? And if not, why not? Before we start, there is a poll which you, as listeners, can look at, decide how many of you are on the side of free will and how many on the side of determinism. While you're deciding that, let me explain how it will work. Each of our speakers will have 10 minutes to convince you of their point of view. They'll then have a further 10 minutes to respond, and then we'll have a discussion and some questions, and then we'll poll you again to see if anyone's changed their mind. Robert, Dan, thank you both very much for joining us. Robert, would you like to start?
Sure, I'd be happy to, and thanks for having me here, and thanks, Dan, for being here as well.
So you've got 10 minutes, 10 minutes to convince us of what you will.
Okay, I thought we were going to be given the polling results, but no, I guess that's a cliffhanger. Okay, so to start, just to start with a very subtle, nuanced stance, I think there is no free will whatsoever. I think that is abundantly clear. And on top of that, I think if people started believing that, it would be a far more humane world. This would be a very good thing. Now, looking at the fact that people very strongly hold on to the notion of free will, I want to try to unpack one of the things that really sort of fuels that stance, which is we make decisions. We make choices. We sit there, we choose vanilla over chocolate ice cream. We choose to pull a trigger or not to do so. We are full of intent at that moment, and we make a choice. And there is something intuitively truly seductive about that. And unpacking the choice, the intent, we know we have the intent at that point. We have a pretty good sense what the consequence is going to be. We know we're not being coerced. There's alternatives available to us and to most people and to courts of law in the United States. That's enough. You have responsibility. And my starting point is that tells us nothing whatsoever about free will. It is completely irrelevant to it. Whether we form an intent to do this or to do that, that is completely irrelevant for a very simple reason. Because assessing behavior based on that is like reviewing a movie when all you've seen is the last 3 minutes of the movie. Because what you're never, ever asking with that stance is, oh, yeah, where did that intent come from? How did you become the sort of person where that is the sort of intent you would form at that moment? Because that's really the only thing to do. It's the only question to ask. Okay, let me give you a scenario that is laden with intent and choice. You got two people. They go in, they watch a movie. The movie is some inspirational movie about some guy who previously has been obscure and now does something incredibly heroic. And the first person comes out of the movie with an intent and a choice. They say, oh my God, that was so inspirational. Right now, I'm going to go over to that booth by the popcorn stand and I'm going to sign over my life savings to Doctors Without Borders. That's how inspired I am. I intend to do that. And the second person has an intent and makes a choice at that point, and they says, oh my God, that was the most outrageously manipulative movie. I can't believe that script. The cinematography was terrible. I'm outraged. I'm offended that they would charge I'm outraged at the theater, and I'm going to go right now and demand my money back. Okay, so we see two people who acted with intent to make choices. And the question obviously then is, how did they become the sorts of people where those are the choices that they would make, where those are the intents they would form? And if you come from a world of biology, as I do, that's a whole hierarchy of questions, because there's a whole hierarchy of things that went into each of those people intending to do what they do. Part of it was playing out in the previous minutes to hours. Were they angry? Were they hungry? Were they in pain? Were they sleep deprived? Were they stressed? Were they scared? Whatever, because we know people's choices will change dramatically in those circumstances. People's judgment, people's executive control, people's capacity to make one type of decision, if it is a tougher one, but it is more appealing in the long run. Okay, so that matters. What also matters in the previous hours to days are hormone levels, because that will, if you had elevated levels of oxytocin, you're more likely to be trusting of what the movie was telling you. If you had elevated levels of testosterone, you were more likely to be pissed off and perceive the movie makers as having bad intent. But you also have to ask what was going on in the previous months to decades. As one example, if you had had a trauma and you now have PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, a structure in your brain, the amygdala will have grown larger, and we can tell you down to the molecules exactly how that works. And when you have an amygdala like that, in circumstances that other people would decide are neutral, you're going to decide is provocative and threatening. And even though we understand much less about it, the same changes, the same drama would have occurred in your brain if in the previous months of the decades, you had found love, you had found God, you had found all of that matters. Okay, so now we got to barrel back to adolescence and childhood. And I think no one needs to be convinced by now that the type of childhood you have influences the type of adult you become. What we've been learning since are the nuts and bolts, the epigenetics of how the brain you have as an adult sitting and watching that movie is going to be vastly influenced.
Just real quick note, I think it's interesting that I just think it's rather bold to make claims such as free will doesn't exist when we still know so little about our brains, and consciousness and dreaming and things like that. So just a little quick note. And again, all these things he's mentioning, these are things that I consider to be factors into the decision making. But I don't think these factors literally predetermine or like fully, completely dictate our decisions ultimately. I just think they factor into the equation of our decision making.
Influenced by how many traumas you had as a child, how much adversity, how much stimulation. And there's a whole world of developmental people who even have a scoring system. What is your ACE score, your adverse childhood experience score? Were you physically abused, psychologically, sexually? Were you witness to? Did you have a family member who was incarcerated? Was there somebody with a substance abuse problem? And each additional, score you get in that questionnaire, there's about a 35% increased chance that by young adulthood, you will have a history of antisocial violence. Childhood matters. The culture you were raised in as a child matters. Are you raised in a culture of honor? Because as an adult, you were more likely to advocate aggressive responses to ambiguous social circumstances, and you're more likely to secrete stress hormones at the time. Were you raised in an individualistic or a collectivist culture? Because that's going to influence your levels of trust and cooperation with people you don't know. Were you raised in a culture with this value, with that, to turn the other cheek, to take revenge because if they take your camel now and you do nothing, tomorrow they'll take the rest of your camels? All of this is instantiated in the brain you develop.
So, and without lies, Islam dies. Sorry, I had just a dyslexic moment for a minute, and I read like Liam Neeson at first. I saw like lies in Islam, and it like read as like Liam Neeson in my head. I don't know. A major dyslexic moment. Anyways, to your comment, it's absurd to say free will doesn't exist. We can't prove that, and we make hundreds of decisions each day freely. And I agree, or I agree that free will does exist. But what his argument is basically that those decisions we make are predetermined by biological and external factors that we can't help, like genetics and past experiences and brain chemistry and survival instincts and stuff like that. So that's his argument, and I don't agree with it, but that's where they're coming from.
But you got to push back even further, back to your fetal life, because what was going on there was directing the brain and its construction that you were going to have now in that moment, forming that intent in that movie theater. If, for example, you were exposed to a lot of stress hormones as a fetus because mom was stressed as hell, trying to pay the rent, being homeless, whatever, you're going to develop a larger amygdala. And as a result, you are going to have an elevated stress response, which is going to make your judgment and executive control not as effective as usual. If you were, as a fetus, deprived of calories, as an adult, you're more likely to form the intent, screw Amnesty International and screw getting my money back. I'm going
to see how he said more likely? You're more likely to
go get a lot more popcorn because you will have developed with fewer dopamine neurons in your reward area, and you will have less satiation. And you will be more prone towards adult onset diabetes, metabolic syndrome, hypertension, obesity, all of that because of your fetal life. Then we got to push a step further back. Genes determine next to nothing. People have to be weaned off to that notion of sort of genetic molecular fundamentalism. But what genes do is influence how you are going to respond to environment. And by now, we know we differ from one person to the next. A variance of genes we have related to hormones like oxytocin and vasopressin. How able are you to have empathy? How trusting are you? How generous? Hormone genes related to your stress response. Do you see threat that other people don't? Genes related to your vulnerability to mood disorders, anxiety disorders, genes related to your propensity towards violence, depending on whether you were abused as a child or not. All of these come into it.
And Robert, one more minute.
You've got to push one step further back. Culture, where'd that come from? If your ancestors grew up in a world with a heavy infectious disease load, you're likely to be more hostile to immigration. If your ancestors grew up as shepherds, you are more likely to be aggressive than if they grew up as farmers. Where is behavior coming from? Where's responsibility coming from? It's coming from 1 second ago to thousands of years ago. And what we have here are a number of punchlines. The first one is, history matters. The past isn't even past. And what we see over and over is the biology of why luck does not even out over time, as Dan has often said. Instead, bad luck amplifies and good luck and privilege amplifies in the opposite direction. What we also see is a realm where these are not just biological influences. If you're talking about genes, you're talking about their evolution. You're talking about the epigenetics of your fetal life that regulate them. You're talking about the proteins they made 20 minutes ago. It forms one continuous arc of biology in which there is not a crack there into which you can shoehorn free will.
He probably believes we don't have a mind.
Can you at least try, bro?
By a mind, do you mean like soul, like a soul, or but even if you don't mean soul when you say mind, I mean, he's kind of suggesting that by saying free will doesn't exist, right? We don't have like the mind to make the decisions, or unless he's saying our mind is just totally mechanical and we have no control over it, which I believe to a degree, but not completely, which is why I do believe like they're compatible, free will and determinism.
If it was 500 years ago and somebody said, wow, we just noticed when people get hammered over the head, their behavior changes, the brain may be relevant, that's one thing. We know a ton now. We know enough to present the challenge. Show me a brain, a person who has just done something completely independent of every one of those biological environmental influences.
Wait, being more likely does not negate choice? You mean more likely does not negate choice? Yeah, being more likely just means that you might be more prone to making one decision or not, but ultimately you still have a choice. And that was what I was trying to argue. I don't know if that's what you're trying to say, but I was trying to argue like all these things he is mentioning contribute and factor into the equation, the ultimate equation of our decision making, and why or we make a decision or why we choose to do what we do, you know, etc. But ultimately the choice is up to us, and all these factors just contribute to the likelihood of choosing one or the other, or our proneness to choosing one or the other. But ultimately, in many aspects of life, we still have the ultimate will to choose those things. Not in every aspect, but in most and many, I'd say.
Influences I just outlined, and you've proven there's free will. And at this point, we know enough of this biology that the onus is on the free will believers. Unless you can show evidence of people's actions, people's behavior, people's personalities, proclivities, desires, etc., being independent of their biological and environmental history, you've presented no evidence that free will exists, and the only default stance there is to doubt that it exists, to not accept its existence.
Thank you. Before I ask you to start, the results of the poll were 59% did believe in free will, 41% didn't. That's where we've started. Okay. Robert, thank you. Dan, there's the challenge for you.
Yes. First of all, I would like to issue a little disclaimer about your poll. You asked whether you believe in determinism or free will. I believe in both determinism and free will. Yes. And because I think that what Robert shows so eloquently is that he's been taken in by the philosophers who have inflated the idea of free will way beyond what it has to be. And he says, if you can't point to a decision you make which is completely free of all earlier considerations and influences, then you can't show free will. But that's just a daft notion of free will. And there's a strange tension in Robert's 10 minutes there. What's he doing? Why is he talking to me? Does he think he can convince me or convince anybody? I think I can convince people, and I think he thinks he can convince people. And that's because we are both receptive to reasons. Now, I agree with everything he says about the hormonal and developmental and epistatic developments that impinge on who one is at the time. That's the raw material each of us starts with, and we don't start in the same place. As he says in his book, Life Isn't Fair. And that's true. There are tremendous differences in style, in talent, in accomplishment, in education, in upbringing, in nutrition. That's true. The whole point of free will is that this.
Can I just say, this guy seems like he would be the coolest grandfather ever. I think I said that about somebody else before, another one of these like philosopher, theologist dudes, but like these guys seem like they would be amazing grandfathers. I don't know why, like I just get that like very friendly grandpa vibe.
This is a socially evolved system which minimizes those, which takes steps to make the world safer for everybody. I counted on Robert being here today. I'm sure he counted on my being here. We both are reliable people. You can trust us. That's one of the key elements of free will, to be self-controlled. Now, Robert says, go back.
It helps.
Years and years and years, go back before your birth. I want to go back even further. I want to go back to the beginning of life. Because when evolution gets started, what begins is a process of skill development. The very first living things were better at staying alive and making progeny than the alternatives. And it's been a growth of skill and competence ever since. And there's skills that Robert and I have that many people don't have, and there's other skills that we don't have. I can't play the violin. I can't dance the minuet. I can't read Persian. There's lots of things I can't do. Too bad, but I've got my own set of skills. He's got his own set of skills. And what civilization has done is this, over the centuries, over the millennia, what civilization has done is to distill out the most important skills for making people safe and reliable citizens. And that is, they have the skill of self-control. Now, that's what evolution is all about. Evolution is about the evolution of the skill of self-control. And we are better self-controlled because we have many more degrees of freedom than any other living thing on the planet. We have a lot more skill. If a tree falls and kills somebody, we don't hold it responsible. It doesn't have the skill. It doesn't have the perceptual organs. It's not able to prevent foreseeable damages because it can't foresee, but we can. Now, there's a quote that I love from the late, great.
You know what's interesting to think about too? Well, I just thought about this, and like, do infants have free will? Like, personally, just from like thinking about it, just like offhand, I would say no, they don't. They're acting purely on instincts. So that would mean that free will comes with knowledge and I guess just knowledge, because they have a consciousness, or I guess like a grown consciousness or something. But babies are kind of like in an animalistic state. I think they even say like a Labrador, like what the smartest dog can like have an equal brain like an equal amount of brain power to like a 3-year-old, or like the smartest dog ever had the equal amount of brain power to like a 5-year-old or something like that. So it has, and I would say even like in what I was like kind of writing about, domesticated animals I think have like a like pinch of more free will than non-domesticated animals do, because they're like, or maybe they don't, it's just like that's how we train them and it just appears that they do, and that's why we get so much joy from domesticated animals, like when they choose to come sit next to us and it seems like they want to spend time with us and it makes us happy. Like the dog reacts to, they wag their tail when they see us and we call their name and stuff. And I think that's so like what's so exciting about like domesticated animals and having interactions with animals like that. So yeah, I'm just curious, what is the point of no free will to free will? And I guess that would have to be knowledge and like a good amount of like consciousness. I would say infants have the capacity for free will. They're limited in neurological development, which inhibits actions, but free will, I would argue, is innate to humans. I do agree it's innate. I just think it has to, I think it comes after a certain amount of brain capacity, I guess. I don't know. I have to think about it more, but that's where I'm at right now.
Novelist and critic Tom Wolfe, who said the conclusion people out beyond the laboratory walls are drawing is the fix is in, we're all hardwired. That, and don't blame me, I'm wired wrong. Well, if you're wired wrong, I won't blame you. But what about being wired right? Not perfectly, but well enough to be held responsible and to hold yourself responsible. I assume Robert has a driver's license.
And just real quick, that's why we have insanity pleas, which in lots of cases I think are bullshit. But I think it does make sense in certain instances, and I think it should be used more so in lesser, like, I think we should be using insanity pleas or just like a defense of insanity for lesser crimes than, like, I feel like I always hear about it in like murder cases and stuff, but I don't know, when it comes to people with mental illness getting arrested for like maybe public disrupting the public and things like that, I think that's when it probably should matter more, because if you're murdering people, it doesn't really matter why you did it. You're a danger to society. So, but it still matters in the ultimate determination of guilt, I guess.
Has self-control enough. I'm not scared if he's out on the highway because he's basically sane and he has self-control. There are other people who shouldn't be on the highway. Now, one of the points that he makes a great deal of in his book, and it's an important one, is that we have to draw the line somewhere. Some people just miss the boat for having the kind of skill, the kind of self-control that entitles them to treat themselves as responsible agents, to make contracts, to make promises, to take care of yourself, to go free in the world. Now, we're learning every day, and Robert has a lot to say about this.
Yeah, Harry, I think that makes more, or that like aligns more with my beliefs. It's developed. We develop free will, which is interesting. But I think it's innate, like you said, to humans, but it has to be developed. But it's developed rather quickly. Like, children start, behaving unpredictably and making decisions and acting, to their own personality pretty young. But again, it's like, are they consciously making those decisions, or are those mostly predetermined by all the things that the determinalism people believe in? So I can see that argument for like very young children, like toddlers. But after like 4, I'd say around the age of 4, you really start seeing children exercise like free will. I worked at a preschool, so that's what I'm going off of. I've worked around kids a lot, but you definitely know a baby has free will very early on. Interesting. And see, I don't have children. I'm also an only child, so I haven't been around infants a lot. So
ways in which people have diminished self-control, diminished capacity. And we have to recognize that beyond some point, and it's going to have to be arbitrary, like driver's license age, we have to say, I'm sorry, you're not responsible. You have lost your free will. It has nothing to do with determinism. It has everything to do with control. I'm getting old. I may lose my marbles one of these days, and then I'll lose my self-control. I'll lose my free will. Free will is an achievement. It's a skill. It's not a metaphysical feature. So when you understand that free will is something that has been described in some detail and with lots of improvements over the centuries by civilizations, and we've made tremendous progress. One of the things I really admire about Robert's book is he goes back and gives lots of detail about the horrific punishments that used to pass muster, that used to be considered all right. None of us want to live in that world. That's terrible. Look, we've made improvement. We've gotten better. We've evolved. We've arrived at a point where we don't draw and quarter people. We don't, and we don't need the horrific blame of guilt in the eyes of God. That's a barbarism that we can exclude.
And one more minute.
Yeah, one more minute. Yes. Now, I find myself in an odd position of saying to a biologist that he should take evolution more seriously. That evolution, as the title of my book, Freedom Evolves, makes clear, shows that there was no free will at all billions of years ago. And the free will has been growing and growing and growing as we become ever more capable of controlling ourselves and controlling each other and thinking about how to control ourselves and improving our methods of self-control. And there's a long way to go.
See, I would think that theists, people who believe in God, wouldn't believe in free will, but I guess they believe that God gives them free will. But to me, it seems like, it's like I always hear things like, Jesus take the wheel, or that's why you have faith, right? Like God knows all, and He knows like what's going to happen, right? Isn't things like, I don't know, I'm not religious, but I always thought that, at least for Christians, they believed that things were predetermined by God. Or there's another saying too that I hear a lot. I'll try to think of it, but like just the fact that you have faith in God and it's like in God's hands, right? Like life is in God's hands, like that was God's will basically. So I always thought that free will kind of clashed with religion, but it seems like most of the free will people, except for, I don't think Daniel Dennet is saying that. I think that's what he just explained, that you don't need God to have free will. But it seems like most of the free will people argue from a religious point of view, or maybe not most of them, but many of them do. So that's something I'm curious about.
Oh, and he himself has spoken about the desire to educate people and get them to see, well, he wants to say that they don't have free will. I say they don't have the kind of free will that some philosophers say they should have, but that's not a variety of free will that anyone should care about. It's not worth having. I have never seen anybody explain why it would be desirable to have an undetermined will. We want our will to be determined by the facts and by our values. That's what self-control is. One thing that Robert says that I would actually invite him to back off on, he says at one point, it's logically indefensible, ludicrous, meaningless to think that something good.
We believe that God does know the future, but it isn't determined. Just by God knowing that will happen doesn't equate to him controlling every move like puppets on a string. Okay. I can fathom that in my mind. So like we have free will and we have the free will to make our decisions, but God already knows the decisions we make. That's the the religious argument. Okay.
But it can happen to a machine. I'm a machine. I'm an evolved machine made of machines, made of machines, made of machines. There's nothing magic about me, but good things can happen to me and bad things can happen to me. That's how good a machine I am. It seems to me that Robert has a secret yearning for a sort of magical power, which he realizes he can't have.
Okay.
I say, no, you can have it.
Robert, thank you, Dan. Robert, would you like to respond? Take up to 10 minutes to do so. You're muted at the moment.
Unfortunately, I'm in Manhattan right now, so there's at least 4 fire engines within a quarter-mile radius, but that's just the norm here. Well, amazingly enough, I don't agree with everything you said, Dan, amid my greatly admiring sort of the eloquence with which you've argued for free will. I think there's something very interesting that you brought up, that quote of mine at the end, which was saying it's ridiculous to say that anything good can happen to a machine. You didn't finish the quote, where I then say, nonetheless, at my very core, I think it is a good thing when we are made to have lives with less pain and more happiness.
So you agree with me?
Yes. Okay. So a good addendum there. Okay. So where we don't agree. One other thing we agree on. Both of us agree, lest we get caught in the sort of mud with this, we both think punishment and reward are okay to use in an instrumental sense.
Yes.
So completely in agreement on that. Okay. So where we're not in agreement.
How are you?
So the first issue is an interesting one in terms of what you describe sort of the evolution of. You point out, say, we do not flay people and burn them at the stake anymore. We have evolved. And in some way, I think you're equating that we have evolved to have more free will, because you're yoking our capacity for self-control to evolution an awful lot. The fact that we don't burn people at the stake anymore, I think shows exactly the opposite, which is over and over throughout history, we have learned, someone is actually not responsible for this. Somebody does not control the weather and thus deserves to be burned at the stake as a witch. Somebody has an epileptic seizure, not because they're sleeping with Satan. Somebody has trouble learning to read because they have dyslexia and we know the neuroanatomy of it, rather than they're lazy and unmotivated. At each one of these steps where we have subtracted out responsibility, where we have viewed the world as having less free will, it's become a much nicer place to live in. Now, as a second point, sort of you're alluding to what I think is another incredibly tempting, seductive way in which to get into trouble, which is to make this false dichotomy. Yes, most people will admit we have no control over some of the attributes that we were given, that we were gifted with, that we were cursed with, and so on. Some of us are tall, some of us have perfect pitch, some of us have good memory spans for digits, some of us this or that, and we were given these traits. Yeah. Most people will now believe, rather than being Calvinists, that this was outside our realm of control. What people then do is this leapfrog over this Grand Canyon of a false dichotomy into, but where we have free will is what we do with those attributes. Do we show tenacity? Do we show gumption and backbone when the going gets tough? Do the tough get going? Do we show self-control? Or conversely, are we privileged and gifted and we squander it away with self-indulgence? The seduction is that things like, how good your memory span is, what type of receptor you have for this neurotransmitter relevant to memory. That's stuff you were given. But what you do with it, your gumption, your control or lack thereof, that's made of fairy dust.
See, I don't think that's such a great leap over this Grand Canyon of a false dichotomy or whatever. I don't think that's that big of a leap, and I don't think he's hitting the point. It's not that somebody's, let's just say, upbringing or their fetal condition, the condition their mother was in when they were a fetus and stuff. Those things might play into how much of a backbone or something you have, like what he was saying. But ultimately, you still have a decision and a choice. And again, I think those factors just show what is the easier decision for that person to make. So Like, some people are better at saving money and some people are better at spending money. And there's probably a whole bunch of external biological and like factors that go back to your childhood and upbringing and et cetera, et cetera. So some people choose to waste and spend money because that's just the easier decision for them to make. But that doesn't mean it's totally predetermined and dictated by those factors that make it easier for that person or more desirable for that person to make that decision. They still have the will to not do that and make the hard decision and save the money.
That's magical stuff. That's a completely different category. And what we see is self-control is as biological of a trait as is your eye color, as is your capacity to play the piano, as is your height. It's a different kind of biology. For my money, it's a hell of a lot more interesting biology, but it's just as biological. And what it's embedded in is a squishy, real, biologically yucky part of the brain called the prefrontal cortex.
Well, I'm right. And that's the thing, too, without lies. The, like, on a quantum level, electrons and things, when we look at them, they move and it's completely unpredictable. And chaos does exist in the universe, which is like a core fundamental or a core foundation of like my value system or just like beliefs and stuff. And it's very like basic and generic, but it's just the yin and the yang, like the balance of chaos and order, positive and negative. And I do think there is an equal amount of chaos and order in the universe that creates everything today. But there are certainly things in nature that are chaotic, unpredictable, and unorderly.
Develop a good prefrontal cortex, you are going to be good at showing self-control as an adult. You will be better at doing the hard thing when it's the right thing to do. Are we responsible for the sort of prefrontal cortices we have? Not a chance. Here's one example that should stop people right in their tracks, that should have people out, yelling at the barricades and singing like revolutionary songs from Les Mis. By the time a child is 5 years old, the socioeconomic status of their parents is already a predictor of the thickness of their prefrontal cortex and its metabolic rate. And big surprise, it goes in the direction of, if you very imprudently intended and chose to be born into a family in poverty, you're going to have a screwed up.
And I'd argue that things like that are limitations. Certain things like that can cause limitations on decision making, but it's just a limit.
Prefrontal cortex on the average by the time you're 5 years old. Bad luck evens out over time. Gumption is not made of biology. This is the biology which every step along afterward is the biology and interactions with environment of why at virtually every juncture this person is going to make the wrong decision and go in the wrong direction. And it has as little to do with choice and free will as your eye color does. I think the final point I want to make with that is running through that is a notion, again, the gumption angle is a source of pulling out judgment and responsibility, which I think is simply antithetical to where the science is. If we can have a quote of yours, Dan, quote, "A good runner who starts at the back of the pack, if he is really good enough to deserve winning, will probably have plenty of opportunity to overcome the initial disadvantage. In other words, if he fails to show sufficient gumption to make up for that deficit, he doesn't deserve to win. It is a moral judgment that he was not able to overcome his initial bad luck because control is made out of magic. Control is something that is not made out of biology." And I obviously strongly disagree with that. I think the very last point, Dan, is there's another realm in which I think you've been seduced.
Wait, isn't that his argument? Isn't that his argument that control is biology? Did he just contradict himself? Or am I confused? I'm sorry if I don't pronounce your name right. Cafe? Cafe. Let me know if I got that right or wrong. Sorry, I'm bad at like pronouncing things. McKenna said that he grew out of atheism in his late teens. It's clear Sapolsky is still trapped in that sort of thinking. McKenna grew out of atheism? Do you mean he was atheist and then he grew out of that and started believing God? I think McKenna does believe. Actually, I have a 3-minute video of just like a clip of Terrance McKenna talking about God. I'm pretty sure he does believe in God, but it's like a deism. That might not be the correct term, but it's like a non-physical God. I don't know how to explain it. I'm pretty sure it's like deism. But we can listen to that too.
Into a great embrace of free will, which is you've got a lot more faith in intuition than I think is justified. For example, you have the really interesting two-stage model of decision-making, which let's not get into it, but I disagree with, blah, blah, big surprise. But you say one of its strengths is it aligns with our intuitions. Quote, that model, quote, provides some account of our important intuition that we are the authors of our moral decisions. In other words, your model for why there's some free will is more acceptable because it fits with our intuition that we have free will. And I think my last point here that I want to make is intuition is a really lousy guide for thinking about how the world works. Let me give you an example. I will bet, Dan, if you and I were sitting in a cafe 400 years ago, we were the same people and just as reflective, and we would have like given money to NPR if it existed at the time and all of that. We would have been the same reasonable people. It would have been
all the way in which I got that
intuitively obvious to us that certain people are meant to be slaves. In fact, they're so incapable of taking care of themselves, it's a blessing to enslave them and feed them and clothe them. And that's not intuitively obvious to us anymore. It's not intuitively obvious that it's okay to have 4-year-olds work in factories. But in the past, it would have seemed intuitively obvious to us as well. It's no longer intuitively obvious that a kid who has a cortical malformation and as a result reverses looped letters and has trouble learning to read because of their dyslexia, it's no longer intuitively obvious to us that they're lazy and unmotivated. But 40, 50 years ago, I suspect both of us would have found it obvious that this is a kid who just really isn't paying attention.
But that's just like an example. That's why I think that they are compatible, because there's certain things that we can't have free will over, right? Like choosing to be able to fly or hold our breath and deep dive in the ocean for an hour without breathing air, and deciding to have dyslexia or not. Like those things, yeah, we can't help that, but there's many other things that we do consciously choose every day. I have that clip of Terrance McKenna. It's only 3 minutes long. If you want to listen to it real quick. It's called What is God?
In a pre-scientific world, you get a vocabulary that is religious. That, there is a force in the universe. Not a sparrow falls, but that this force doesn't take note of it.
Oh, there's
this
no subtitles.
Force is love. This force created everything. This force cares for us. We are its children. It is calling us to return to its essence. I mean, this is a religious vocabulary. But in the 20th century, we've
Let me answer this real quick. How does fear of repercussion play into his ideology? I have yet to hear an enforcement mechanism to hold society together. Right, and it's funny because in the beginning of this, he actually argued that his determinism what actually makes for a better society. So believing that we don't have free will actually makes for a better society. And I think that's because he thinks free will like inherently puts responsibility and blame and punishes people for things that they can't control. So like what he was just saying, a kid with dyslexia, back in the day, we would have just called the kid lazy and stupid. But today, we now know that he's not choosing to be lazy and stupid. That is predetermined by his dyslexia. But I understand for arguments like that, but I also think this would lead to a very kind of fucked up society, because we're taking full responsibility away from everyone and all of their actions and blaming it on genetics, biology, and just all these predetermined factors from our childhood. And I think if people ended up believing that they don't actually have a choice and don't have free will, and their actions are determined by their circumstances and genetics, then they're going to make excuses for making bad decisions and justifying bad decisions with reasoning like that, like, oh, well, I grew up without a mom, or I grew up in poverty, or I was abused as a kid, or my mom drank when she was pregnant with me. So I just feel like that would make people justify making the wrong decision more and not take responsibility. And then also we wouldn't really be able to punish them if everybody believed this, because it's not their fault, right? It's predetermined. They actually have no free will in their decisions. So I don't know how this view would help humanity at all. Yeah, let me finish this Terrance McKenna thing really quick, because I think it's interesting.
Gone beyond that. We're no longer moving in a coinage of emotional terms. We can say, God is physics. God is the universe trying to birth itself into a higher dimension. God is the universe's appetite for self-reflective complexity coming into its fullest flower. And then the distinctions between science and religion are seen to be small potatoes indeed. I mean, we can calculate.
What he described is like very much what I believe. Like, God is physics. God is what gives. God has like the appetite for self-reflection, which is shown through evolution, and survival of the fittest and things like that.
Our way towards the second coming, I maintain. Well, this is somewhat far afield from most people's ideas of what constitutes botanical shamanism, but not mine, because I think that we could have lived in the light of this gnosis and never made the descent into history that we made with the abandonment of partnership society, psychedelic religion, pastoralism, and so forth. We were designed to live in paradise until the coming of the kingdom, but instead we fell into history, which is a kind of hell, where the animal nature was able to reassert its power over the human dream. And we have lived in that, with that paradox now for some 12,000 years, and it's left us fairly frazzled and sketched out, I think. Well, if this is what is on a macro scale happening to the human race, and this goes back to the question some time ago of what should be done, if this is what's happening on a fractal macrocosm, then what you can do to aid this process is just accelerate your own arrival at the omega point. And what that means is psychedelicize yourself. Begin to deconstruct the hold over your freedom that culture, history, biology has on you, and begin to experiment with the concept of yourself as a being trembling on the edge of true liberation, because I think that's probably what you really are.
Okay, that's the end of that. Yeah, I don't know. I like that little sound bite from him. I think I agree with a lot of what he says there. And someone brought up Terrance McKenna, so I figured I'd play that real quick. Jimmy Beam, my high school physics teacher, public school, was Catholic and always said science tells us how things happen, God tells us why. I can fathom that too. And when I was first coming into my like newfound beliefs that are more like aligned with like Wicca and spiritualism and mysticism, I can't fucking say it. Anyways, more aligned with those types of things. I grew up Christian and I was trying to hold on to believing in Jesus and God and also my new beliefs. And that was one of the ways I did it. It was just like science explains what the universe is, but God is what made it all the way it is. So that's how I first handled that, but I'm not Christian anymore. But I do think science, for the most part, can be compatible with religion. I think in some cases it can't, but that's what's up for debate for everybody, right? Because nobody knows. Anyways, we can get back to the video. Oh, also, well, I guess, I don't know, that's interesting your public school teacher was talking about God. Well, I guess teachers like talk about their beliefs and stuff and say what their religion is. If the universe is self-reflective, it must be conscious and or intelligent, as reflection is a conscious act. Well, yeah, and we are the consciousness that grew from the universe, right? We are just matter. We're made of matter that grew and was birthed from the elements and properties of the physical universe, and we've evolved to have a consciousness which is now self-reflecting of itself and of from which we've come from. I'd easily say all modern science still fits within theological understanding. That's why I highlighted public school. LOL. Okay, yeah. I was curious about that.
Motivated over and over and over. Our intuitions have proven wrong. Over and over, when we realize our intuitions are a very poor litmus test and we recognize we are intuitively punishing and rewarding and judging and all of that for things people had no control over and over, when we recognize that these intuitions, in fact, are based on responsibility, which is simply not there, the world becomes a better place. It really is a very good.
So I want to read this one too. Bill Hicks said he took an Eastern philosophy class and the teacher said God is consciousness and we are all God trying to realize our fullest potential. Yeah. And so that's one of my like intuitions about kind of the purpose of life and the drive behind survival and life and reproduction, you know, just the drive to survive and procreate and continue on and evolve is the pursuit of knowledge. Like, and I do think it's like the universe, again, trying to understand and contemplate itself and reach some kind of point of knowledge or some kind of goal. And I don't know, like, again, I can't fully believe, or I can't fully say that is my belief, because I can't I just don't know for certain. But right now, where I am in life, that is where my intuition is telling me about kind of God and the drive, the purpose of life and stuff like that. If the universe began to exist, which the evidence suggests it did it bring itself into existence? Oh, I forgot to read the second part. Then a guy in the back of the class yelled, "Yeah, are we going to need to know that? Is that going to be on the quiz?" Good job, guy in the back of the class. Yeah, I don't know if the fucking question that has bothered me since I was a little kid, since before I could even understand it, is why is there anything and not, why is there not just nothing? Why is there anything at all? It just seems like there's just so many things that come together to like create all of this like intricate and very like varied and complex life form, and it's so vast. It just seems like there's some like there should be a reason for it, right? Or otherwise, why wouldn't just nothing exist? Unless it's just like that's just what it is. But why? I don't know. I think the question is far more simple. It is possible that a universe can exist without any facts. There are brute facts of reality, one being that there are facts in reality. Well, I'm going to have to read that like a couple more times. I'm going to keep playing the video though.
Thing that we figured out witches don't control the weather, and we figured out that rotten psychoanalytically poisonous mothers don't cause schizophrenia, and that people with a certain variant of a gene for the leptin receptor have trouble having their brains satiate rather than them just hating themselves and thus eating themselves into obesity. At every one of these steps, our initial intuitions have proven very, very suspect and wrong, and at each step, when we actually learn what's going on, we subtract responsibility out of it. And not only doesn't the societal roof fall in, it becomes a much better place to live in.
Okay, thank you. Dan, would you like to take 10 minutes to respond?
Yes, indeed. First of all, thank you, Robert, for giving me some wonderful examples to talk about. You quote me twice, and in both cases, you ignore the fact that I reject the view that you quote. So I forgive you for that, because you're not responsible. You couldn't help it. It was the various imbalances in your brain that led you to misunderstand the quote about the marathon. The very passage where you cite in your book, page 376 of Freedom Evolves, I go on to say, but that's wrong. I say that misleads. It underplays the role of non-fortuitous breaks in the race to responsible agenthood. If you'd read the rest of the sentence, but I guess you hadn't have enough self-control to do that. But if you had, you would have realized that you were misquoting me. And as for the two-stage model, the whole point of that article is to say the two-stage model doesn't work. So you sort of admitted that I didn't endorse that model. So you found one thing that I gainsayed about it. I said, well, it does meet an intuition. But I didn't, on that ground, support the model. In fact, I rejected the model.
So someone said, Ramesh Balsekar. God, sorry, I'm so sorry. I butchered that, but said that reality at its basis is energy, and its nature of energy to be perpetually renewable, and so the Big Bang and everything retracts back into the potential, then another Big Bang and another universe, and this process repeats itself. So yeah, I mean, that's kind of where I was at. I do feel like a core piece of the fabric of the universe is energy, right? Like just light, heat, all these things, like even just the atoms and molecules that are like moving it's all just like energy. I'm not an expert by any means on this, obviously, but I do think energy is like an essential part of the fabric. And yeah, it in my head, the best way I can like picture it in my head is that it's kind of like a chemical soup of the universe that expands, and then things get to a certain point where they pull back into each other or something, and they all explode, or there's some kind of like domino effect of explosions of stars or something, and then there's like another big bang. But my problem is, where do these elements come from in the first place? All these different chemicals and things, where do they originate from? Is it still true that matter cannot be destroyed or created? And then somebody else said something too. Stoner thought, what if the purpose is love, and those with disabilities he is talking about were purposely created to teach us what love is? I don't know about the disabilities part, but I do think, just as like a I don't know, I think as a personal belief, and it might seem kind of like stonery, hippy dippy, silly, whatever, I feel like love is a part of that energy or force of life, like obviously more than just like survival and procreation and stuff, but it seems to be a part of that comes with like the growth of consciousness and free will, because again, it's like something that's unique to the human experience for the most part. Although I will argue that I think many intelligent animals do show signs of love. They definitely show signs of grief and mourning, like elephants and orca whales and dolphins, like animals like that. I'd even say dogs, but I'm sure there's some scientists who would argue that there's a word for it, but it's when people attach human-like actions to animals, and we're misinterpreting, we're basically like personifying animals, and it really doesn't correlate to the reality. But I don't know, I don't think we give animals, especially smart animals, enough credit sometimes.
So, but since you don't have responsibility, I don't blame you. I'm a little sorry. I'm a little disappointed that you don't take responsibility for these errors. I try to take responsibility for my errors, and I would hope other people would too. At one point you say, as we've seen, rejection of free will doesn't doom you to break bad, not if you've been educated about the roots of where our behavior comes from. I agree with that, with everything, except you're taking on the definition of free will as being incompatible with determinism, but it's not. That's what compatibilists say. We say, no, you don't need indeterminism. What you do need is chaos. You do need that squishy, messy, impossible to predict goings on in your neocortex and elsewhere in your brain, because we have to be a little bit unpredictable. We have to keep our counsel. We don't want to be controlled by others. The whole key to free will is, yes, you're not responsible for becoming a free-willed, responsible person, but once you become one, you now have the talent to resist being turned into a puppet. You can maintain your autonomy in the face of other influences. Now, not always. but at least you know you should try, and you do. And I really admire the honesty of your book. You acknowledge a lot of your own mental imbalances. That
Anthropomorphic is that the word you're giving me for when we call traits that animals do, or when we assume things that animals do are like a human thing? I'm pretty sure that was the word. I think that's right. If that's what you were writing that in the chat for, thank you.
Bother you, and I'm saying you already agree with me that.
Oh, never mind. I'm completely wrong. It's a word like that. It starts with an A, or hold on. I don't know. I'm gonna. I'll try to look it up, but sorry.
Free will of the sort that I'm talking about is a desirable thing. It's what you strive for, and what, to a very great degree, you achieve. You say at one point, first, it isn't free will and responsibility just because on the social level everyone says it is. That's the central point of the book. And I'm saying,
Oh no, yeah, that's right. It's anthropomorphism is the attribution of human traits, emotions, and intentions to non-human entities. It is considered to be an innate tendency of human psychology. So yes, that was the word. So thank you.
that sentence reveals that you have bought the pathetic line of those incompatibilist philosophers who insist that free will depends on indeterminism. It doesn't. It depends on randomness. Let me put a question to you. Does evolution depend on indeterminism or on randomness, like a coin flip? Coin flips aren't random. They're just not controllable. They're determined. They're just not controllable. Evolution depends on the uncontrollable generation of diversity. But that doesn't, you can't prove indeterminism by citing natural selection as your proof, because natural selection works fine with deterministic chaos.
Robert, do you want to answer that?
Yeah, very briefly. This is your two-stage model, Dan, which is stage one is a generation of randomness, a chaoticism that bubbles up all sorts of options for behavior. And as you point out, filtering out the nonsense, what should I do next? Bark like a dog, that's probably not very viable, a reasonable number of them. And then stage two, you choose. You weigh them, you reflect all of that, and you choose which of those options you do. And all that does is take us back to where I started. How did you wind up being the sort of person where that's the choice you would make, that's the values that you have, that's the thing you consider to be most important? That's the same issue again.
When you say evolution can be controlled, do you mean like selective breeding, like eugenics? Or do you mean something else?
You did not choose to become the sort of person who would make that choice at that point. It's absolutely a choice at that point. And yes, I agree with your sort of chaoticism of generating options, doing a couple of filterings. Richard Dawkins has done fascinating stuff on how we filter out the nonsense of options and algorithms for doing that. We focus in on the reasonable stuff. And then the sort of person that circumstances outside your control have made you chooses among the options. We're back to where I started. Absolutely.
Well, Robert, you and I are who we are because of that whole long history that goes back to the birth of life. But one of the wonderful things about what civilization has managed to do is to create a perspective where that doesn't matter all that much. And where, because of education, because of all the research that you and your colleagues do, we've learned how to address and counteract a lot of the effects. And where we can't counteract them, we excuse people. Some people don't have free will, but many people do have free will that they get because they have been.
I'd say you're affecting, if you have the ability to change outside factors, whether you are aware or not, you are controlling evolution. I'd say you're affecting evolution, not necessarily controlling it. When I think of control, I think of intent, like having an intent behind it.
Fortunate enough to know they weren't responsible for this, but they were lucky enough to get treated for the conditions that maladapted their brains for citizenship. And I agree with you. We should do a lot more. You say at one point in your book, we've got to have education. We've got to teach people what the real sources of a lot of these motivations are. And we are doing it, and we have been doing it. And that's what free will is. And it's only because we can do that that we can treat one group of human beings, not the young children, not the senile, not the brain damaged, as capable of taking responsibility for the judgments they make. And we hold them responsible, and they hold themselves responsible. And
I guess that kind of goes into like why we have different punishments for minors. There, you can be charged as an adult sometimes, even if you're under the age of 18. But that's why we have those differences, because minors can't be held as responsible fully for their actions as much as an adult, like a fully grown adult with a fully developed brain and experience can. Oh, no need to apologize. I'm just chatting. Oh, I accidentally muted this. Okay.
the ideal system of punishment, and I'm glad you agree with me that punishment is a
Who is
necessity.
visiting?
You can't have a civilization without punishment, without law and order. The ideal situation of circumstance of punishment is where you have a system of punishment which is so fair and so non-awful that the person punished says, thanks, I needed that.
Would you mind if I ask a couple of questions? I hope my questions won't be too silly, but Robert, if I could put to you, if I've understood you, are you suggesting that you wrote this book, a big, long, tremendously interesting book? Are you saying that the book was written as the culmination of all the circumstances of your life?
Speaking of politics, Trump was fucking shot yesterday. That's crazy. Happened in PA, my state. Not that that's like something to be proud of or anything, but like just saying it happened, even though it happened on all the way the other side of the state, so it was like 5 hours away. But yeah, that shit's crazy. I'm gonna be on a panel tomorrow night actually talking about that, so that should be interesting. I need to do some research behind the shooter. I know he was like a 20-year-old. I know he was registered as Republican, but there were some signs that he was Democrat in his I was gonna say later years, even though he's 20, so he's only been registered for 2 years. So Trump is basically Tupac now. Yeah, I don't know if I'd go that far, but you know, maybe if it happens 8 more times, I could say 50 Cent, but do you know the implications if he would have died with no vice president and no legal way to nominate a new candidate?
Do you think we should learn how to play dust? Because
there's no legal way to nominate one. Because I know, like, Biden can still change, right, at the Democratic convention or whatever. Can't the Democrat electee whatever be changed still? That's what people are arguing about. I don't know much about politics, so it's interesting that interesting. That would have been crazy, yeah.
Nick, what's worse, vinegar or dust?
I know, I saw that, and when I first saw it, I didn't know that they had immediately killed the shooter, and I was like, I was like, stop fist pumping. I was like, get off stage. Oh my God, like go. But he might have been aware that they immediately sniped the shooter. But yeah, that was pretty crazy. He had blood running down his face and stuff, and he's like, all the security people are like, no. Oh, okay. Thanks for explaining that, Jerry.
But you didn't, that none of your thoughts.
I might start looking into some political stuff. I don't know. Politics isn't like my favorite, but with election season coming up, maybe I'll cover some more political things.
Were in a sense willed by you.
I'll definitely cover the second debate again.
The book was written through you by the circumstances of the whole of life and yours. It's an odd situation, but I think that's what you're saying. And if you're not saying that, please clear up my misunderstanding.
Oh, that's absolutely the case, and that was my thinking and where I was at even before I became daft from reading philosophers.
It is a very dangerous thing, I can tell you. Yeah,
I know this now as a biologist. Yeah, that's the reality, and as Dan alludes to, it produces a tremendous challenge for us. We are biological machines, just like amoeba are, but we are the only biological machines that can know our machineness. And that produces everything from self-reflection to phenomenal neuroses to like denial to everything else on Earth. We're the only ones who are capable of simultaneously saying, wow, that's nice that that person just complimented me on the color of my eyes, while saying, that's completely asinine. I had nothing to do with it. Wow. To say, that's a great job that you did, that you're now CEO of the company, and recognizing at the same time, I was already born on third base. I had all of the, we're a weird, troubled, foibled species for that reason, because we can know our machineness at the same time that we can fall for the palpability with which we feel as if we are captains of our own fate. And what that winds up meaning is, yeah, it's hard to keep that in mind. Keep it in mind for when it really matters, for when you're judging harshly.
Okay, so can I ask you, Dan, a similar question? If I've understood your view, I've read several of your books.
These old men would not be able to address the philosophy problem of the difference between a universe that can and is known to a universe that isn't knowable and has no way of being known. Would you consider a different dimension? Because I think lots of scientists have suspected that there are other dimensions, but I don't think it's like confirmed or anything. But would you suspect a different dimension to be a different universe, or is it our own universe? Our own universe just has multiple dimensions within it. Debate between Dennet and Hawk Tuah Girl. Be interesting. I'm sure they'd have a lot to talk about.
I think what you're saying is you agree with Robert that there's this long, the whole of history of life and then all of your particular life. But I think you're also saying that evolution has created within the machine that you are an ability to judge possibilities and choose between them. So you think that there's a part of the machine.
Yes, that's
okay.
right.
And Robert doesn't think there is that part of the machine.
No, we're in complete agreement there. As part of your machine, you weigh the possibilities and you choose. You generate options through mechanisms that may or may not be dependent on chaoticism, nonlinearity, blah, blah, etc. You generate options and yeah, you choose. But that has nothing to do with whether or not there's free will, because the choice you make reflects the values, tastes, etc. that you had no control over in you becoming the person who you are. It's back to that same thing. Where did that intent come from?
But don't you want?
So what would another universe entail? Would it have to be a certain distance away, or? That's very confusing. Something just beeped. I don't know why. Anyways.
To take responsibility for your character and your judgment and your political views and your moral views? Don't you identify with them? Don't you think, lucky me, I'm not responsible for having the.
Oh no. R.I.P. Daniel Dennett. I just actually I heard of his name, but I just started watching his videos today or yesterday or something. He seems like a very cool guy.
My dasher's been at McDonald's for like 15
But
minutes.
seems like he's had a very long and fulfilling, successful career.
Lucky.
So rest in peace.
Free will that I have, but I am happy to say that people can trust me. They can reason with me. They can change my mind. I'm open to discussion. That's what free will is. It's not indeterminism. It has nothing to do with indeterminism, any more than evolution has to do with indeterminism.
Okay, which nicely moves us into this moral realm. Don't I want to take responsibility for my actions, my achievements, all of that? Isn't that a good thing? That's a terrible thing, because we have.
Someone said earlier, they haven't heard this guy Robert Sapolsky mention anything about the mechanics to sorry, I said mechanics because he used the word in his comment, but
Nice. How you feel?
how
You feel good?
well, yeah, I guess the mechanics of how like
I'm down.
crime and dealing with crime and punishment and morality and stuff would work in society with his view on this. So I think he's about to get into that now.
Have a world in which we think it is okay to treat some people way better than average, including you and me, because of things we had no control over, and to treat other people way worse than average, and then to butter them over with crap about this is a just world in which people get what they deserve. If taking responsibility for your achievements, all of that, leads you to decide that you're entitled, you've earned to have your needs considered more than that of any other person out there, this, in fact, is a terrible outcome. And we run on that terrible outcome that we feel as if we have earned our rewards and punishments.
And if you got caught plagiarizing a scientific paper or fudging data, would you take responsibility for that?
Absolutely. In the
Well,
mechanics.
good. So you agree with me. It's a good thing to take responsibility.
In the same way that I can say that right now, I am responsible for the fact that not only is my arm moving, but all the quarks that make up my arm, I have caused to move. Yes, we're getting caught up in the agents are things that cause things to happen. Agents do things, non-agents do not do things. Yes. But this is not the level we're talking about. We're talking about, is this a world where it is okay, not only if you were born in poverty in our wonderfully just nation that you and I share, that you are overwhelmingly likely to remain in poverty in adulthood. If you were born to parents who are upper middle class, you're far more likely to wind up in my classroom at Stanford than in the county prison. All of that, that's the level that.
See, I hate that argument. Like, I totally agree that privileges exist in various forms, right, amongst people. Some people just have a born advantage on this planet, and some have disadvantages, whether it be genetics or your parents or where you grow up and your school district, whatever it is. Some people certainly have privileges and some people certainly have disadvantages, but his way of thinking, his worldview on this makes it seem like those people with disadvantages have no
do not use that in league matches.
Way of
Actually, don't use it in
escaping that, or like they're just totally helpless. Yeah, he's making it like you're just completely helpless and you have no power, you have no willpower or dictation over overcoming your circumstances and ending up in that Stanford classroom. And again, yeah, there's some factors that can completely or like ultimately dictate certain things happening, but those are more rare. I feel like those are the exceptions, like having like being born with like brain damage or a severe disability or something like that, like a totally just
If you're gonna do anything, you take a pill off.
things like that. So I don't know, I just hate this argument that it's like,
I think you should.
if you're born in a circumstance where like some elements are stacked against you, like you grew up in poverty, maybe you have a slight learning disability, maybe you're poor, your parents are divorced or something like that. It's like, well, it's predetermined you're gonna be a loser. No, that's not predetermined. That just means that it's going to be a lot more difficult to get to certain places that other people can get with more ease.
What was that?
We're dealing with that.
Okay, well, let's deal with it.
That's-
And I think here we agree. We both think we should do what we can to improve those conditions. We should do what we can to eliminate poverty, to eliminate child abuse, to eliminate malnutrition. And if we do that, then more and more people will be able to make the rather minimal criteria for being, responsible enough to have a driver's license. You make a big deal in your book about the gardener at Stanford, whom you see dutifully trimming up around the edges while you're at some commencement ceremony.
I'm muted. Fuck. Okay. Damn it. Okay. What was I saying? Okay. If we are predetermined to evolve and prescribe self-determination, how can you argue that someone can choose to be self-destructive? Right. Thanks. I see the chat now. Okay. So you can. Okay. Right. So yeah. The determination or the determinism. I guess I'm just gonna call them determinists. I hope that's the right word. The determinists believe that they don't choose to be self-destructive. They would argue that somebody who murdered somebody didn't ultimately make that decision, and it was basically willed by all of the billions of years of previous actions and then reactions that then scientifically led to that person murdering that person. And they're actually not to blame, but they still justify jail sentencing and stuff by, well, a lot of them don't believe in punishments, and especially punishment of a certain extent, or they say that punishment should be lessered. It just removes all responsibility from autonomy and responsibility from people, which I think it's kind of just silly. And I think it really dumbs people down, especially when you're saying like, oh, people, who are born with disadvantages, especially multiple of them, they're just predetermined to be fuck ups. Like, all that means is that it's going to be harder to get to certain places that other people can get to with, again, like a lot more ease than they can. But ultimately, they still have the choice, and it might just be a factor of taking longer or, you know, them just not having enough will to make those choices.
But I dare say he's an honest man. He's a responsible man. You don't know whether he's thrilled to death to be able.
And then obviously some things you can't control, right? But that doesn't, just because there's some things that we can't control that are outside of our control, beyond our control, doesn't mean that free will doesn't exist.
To, you know, perhaps bring his family from somewhere, you know, in South America where he was in great difficulties, and now he's in the United States. He's got a job. He's taking care of his family, and he's proud to be an honest man, and he's proud to deserve the salary that Stanford pays him. There are lots of people like that. There are people that from every walk of life who prize their self-control and their free will.
Can I just, Dan, you were saying, you know, you were saying that you both agree that we should do something about these moral questions. But am I right in thinking that you, Dan, think that you have the free will to say, I'm going to do something about this? Whereas if I've understood you, Robert, you can't say, I'm going to do something about this. The circumstances of your life and prehistory will either mean that you will do something about it or you won't. But you, Robert, are not going to make that choice. You're merely going to observe it.
In effect, yes. But maybe more helpful is to frame sort of the things that both Dan and I would like to accomplish. Dan's is an agenda, God help me for saying a word this verboten these days, but of a liberal, which is to say it's important to remember the edge cases. Brain damage, okay, keep in mind they're a special case, that sort of thing. But for everybody else, we have a realm in which responsibility makes sense. And I would characterize where I'm coming from as one as far, far more radical.
It is from 2024. It is from January 14th of 2024 this year. That was a factor into doing it.
What we see when somebody has brain,
well, choosing this specific debate, I also thought it was a good at least intro debate for me.
Damage is an easy task for us. We can see the thing that robbed them of responsibility. But when we look at everybody else, we have the far harder task of we need to see thousands and thousands of spider web thick cables of the influences that started from the beginning of life until 1 second ago. And it's a hell of a lot harder to see that. And science has made less progress with that. And it's a whole lot easier to look at that complicated scenario and say, this one is not an exception. This is one where we can hold them responsible. That's the limits of what science has told us constitute edge cases. There are no edge cases. There's just ones where the causality is easier to see because it was mostly from one sledgehammer of an influence rather than a gazillion. But it's the same threads that ultimately bind us.
So you wouldn't continue to have tests for whether somebody is capable of driving on the highway?
Oh, of course, absolutely.
Well, then you're going to be making those judgments. One thing you ought to consider, how about asking them? How about asking them whether they want to be held responsible or whether they want to be treated as put them in some kind of quarantined lodge and remove from them the capacity to move about in society? I don't want to do that with people. If they want to be out and about and free, I'm all for it, as long as they agree to follow the rules of society, the laws, and behave them.
Oh, okay, Jacob. I was wondering if that was you when you made that comment. I was like, is this the person that left the comment about the content being super old? Well, welcome back.
Themselves.
But are you, Robert, saying, well, it's not a matter of whether they agree or not? Whether they were going to agree or not was predetermined.
and predetermined and inculcated into them as to whatever their intuitions are about how the world should or shouldn't work and whether they deserve to be in their place or not. Where we're having this difference is, yes, absolutely, we should recognize that, like, it's bad to have murderers running around on the streets.
If I'm making crazy faces, it's because I have something in my eye.
We need to protect people from that. That seems undeniable. And there are ways of doing that without having to invoke a responsibility. And at the same time, we also want to make sure that we have competent people removing your brain tumor than someone randomly chosen off the street. It is possible to create a world in which we protect people from dangerous things without invoking a medieval sense of responsibility, and to have competent people doing the difficult things without it being an issue of responsibility and without it being an issue of you are more worthy because you happen to have the skills that allow you to drive a car safely or to take out somebody's glioblastoma.
Then we have hardly any disagreement, Robert, because you want to get rid of a medieval notion of responsibility. So do I.
Okay.
So do I.
Can I I'll put some questions from the audience to you both? Would that be all right? We have Logan.
Look at that library. It's a pretty sexy library.
Polk Smith asks, why do many people fear that adopting a deterministic worldview will lead to...
Oh, and if people have book recommendations, I'm trying to get into reading again. Well, to be honest, I was never really into reading. I used to actually really dislike reading because it would give me a headache, and I probably have like ADHD or something, but I would like start reading a paragraph and then my mind would wander and I'd end up reading the same paragraph like over 4 times. So I was like a really slow reader. But then I would find certain books that I loved and I literally couldn't put them down. I would get so lost in them, like it was like a movie almost, and I couldn't put them down. So I do like reading. I guess I just have to find books that I want to read. But I just moved into a new apartment and I have this really nice rooftop deck area, and I would love to go sit out there, especially with the fall coming up, and read some books. So feel free to throw some book suggestions in the comment section, preferably in the actual comment section of the video and not in the chat. If you put them in the chat, I can see them again on the replay, but it's just easier to go back. It's easier to find in the actual like comment section under the video when the video ends.
Moral action, and asks what kind of actual changes would occur if we do believe in a deterministic worldview. Either one of you? Robert, would you like to start?
Sure. This is the thing that worries everyone. We're going to run amok. And there's a small literature showing that if you experimentally manipulate people into believing a little bit less in free will, they're more likely to cheat at an economic game 10 minutes later. One thing worth noting is that those studies have not replicated, but the much more important thing is to note when you take somebody, not who's been manipulated into believing less in free will since they came in to get their $5 for volunteering for this experiment, but somebody who shows up who already does not believe in free will, what the studies show is they are exactly as ethical in their behavior as do people who have thought long and hard and decided we should be held responsible. How does that happen? Such opposite poles? Because these are not really opposite poles. In both cases, these are people who have thought long and hard. What are the roots of human goodness? Why are we here? What is the source of meaning? All of that. And if you've done that hard work, much as with the high levels of ethical behavior, whether you look at someone who is highly religious or someone who is very stridently atheistic, you've done the hard work. In both cases, you wind up getting very ethical people. If we have a world in which that's a starting point, the notion of people running amok because there's no responsibility is a...
Okay, so I'm kind of like reading through your conversation in the chat. So this makes me wonder, by what you guys are talking about, would that mean that and I don't mean this, actually, I mean this in a super literal sense. Would God then be nothing? And not that like, oh, God is nothing, God doesn't exist, but God would be nothingness. Because that could be the only thing that could exist outside of the universe not existing. Does that make sense? That's just like a thought.
Complete red herring. I don't know. As we have it, we have a world in which most people are inculcated into thinking that there's an omnipotent whoever up there who's going to hold us responsible. And we haven't done a pretty impressive job of being moral amid that. So I think the notion that we're being held for responsibility, I think that's what fuels, Dan, both your and my atheism. Theism does not have a particularly good track record, but nonetheless, no, if you raise people to think that we are the outcome of all that came before, this is not going to be a world in which people run amok. This is a world in which people are going to be more empathic and less blaming for reasons that are totally different from the world we have now, except for the edge cases that you cite.
Well, those people will have what I consider free will. Now, you don't want to admit that you say it isn't free will and responsibility just because on the social level everyone says it is. That's the central point of the book. That's a quote from you. And I say, well, that's a point that I really disagree with you on, because I think everybody who says they have free will, they've got it right, because that's what free will really is. Let me try a simple example on you. You agree that money is real? Money is real?
Sure.
Yeah. Dollars are real. Good. Doesn't depend on the gold standard, does it?
Well, insofar as I understand next to nothing about it, sure, I'll take that.
I mean, people used to think that you couldn't have money unless you had something that was intrinsically economically valuable, like gold or something. No, we now understand money is a brilliant social construction. It's real. People believe in it. Now, there are people who go around saying, no, money is an illusion. There's no such thing as money, really. All there is neuromodulators and squishy stuff in the brain and so forth. But that's a very Pickwickian position. When I go to sign a mortgage, as I did recently, the notary public asked me, are you signing this of your own free will? And I said, yes. And I meant what she meant by free will. I'm not being coerced. Nobody's got me under remote control. I'm not being blackmailed. And I've got enough of my wits about me still so that I am legally entitled to sign this document. That's what free will is. It's the philosophers who have inflated that into this bizarre metaphysical contraption of indeterminism. They're the ones that have foisted, may I say, on you, a medieval notion of free will, which has long since vanished.
Good. We're right back where we started, which is for you, intent and awareness, there's alternatives. All of that is enough to satisfy your definition that you were acting freely there. Let's unpack that. How did you become the sort of person who would value taking on the financial burden and responsibility of a mortgage rather than spending it all on liquor at the bar? How did you become the sort of person who at your stage of life would decide that ownership of land is a good investment? How did you become the sort of person who decided that you're actually going to do that rather than defraud this bank because you figured out a way to do it? How did you become?
Lucky, I guess.
Well,
I think that was a bad answer. I think that was his like biggest L of this debate, was his answer saying, well, just lucky, I guess.
If it was a double, I'd tell you.
Just lucky, but nonetheless.
But I don't even think he really means it. I think that was kind of just like a natural response, like just a quick response or something. I don't know, because everything he's been saying so far doesn't really like align with that.
Because of things you had no control
that
over.
Answer.
Because at this stage,
of luck.
You were exactly, and that's the whole point. We are nothing more or less than the sum of the biological luck that has made us and its interactions with the environmental luck which has made us. That's all we are. All we are is what came before, over which we had no control.
This is just like such a overly sympathetic argument, I think. Like, it's just so overly sympathetic.
Once again, the past isn't even past. The past is who we are now. And somehow you wound up being the sort of person with the values, abilities, self-control.
Oh, and just real quick, Jimmy said, OMG, I want fries. Yeah, so I guess my boyfriend ordered some Uber Eats or whatever, and literally we say this every time we order, like, oh, what are they gonna forget? It's like 100% chance they're gonna fuck up. And this order, they literally left out so many, the majority of things, and they got like other things wrong. It's crazy. We just think they just like throw random shit in there, like they don't even look. And the fucked up part is the receipt has all the right items listed right on the outside. And then he ordered drinks, and the drink cup holder is in the bag for the order, but there's no drinks in it. Like, the fuck?
Etc.
Crazy.
To take out a mortgage at this point.
Can I interrupt for a second? It may be that we can ask people to have another poll and see if anyone's changed their mind, see if the circumstances of their lives mean they were going to. And while they're thinking about that, am I right in thinking, it's just a final question if you don't mind, it seems to me, if Dan, you would consider that it would be possible for you to choose to change your mind, having listened to Robert. But Robert, would you be able to change your?
Oh, I guess I can't blame the people working at McDonald's, though. It wasn't their fault. It was predetermined by some external circumstances that they have no control over. Like, it was just willed that they were gonna fuck up this order this bad. Of course. I can't blame them.
Your mind, given that the
Sarcasm, obviously.
circumstances of your life are the same, it seems to me that you're not going to be able to change your mind. Am I right, or have I misunderstood?
Yes, I could not choose to change my mind right now. Nonetheless, my mind could be changed because I've become the sort of person who could be convinced by a solid argument. I've become the sort of person where I am not thrown into a panicked, secure state of admitting that I'm wrong. I'm not the sort of person where out of perversity, I want to do the exact opposite of whatever.
So there is an imbalance here. In other words, Dan can choose to change his mind himself. You, Robert, have to rely on Dan to choose your mind.
I do not think Dan can choose.
to try to change your mind.
Because he became the sort of person who watching a movie cares about cinematography, and the sort of person who watching a movie cares about inspirational, emotional. Because of who we are at this moment, we react to our circumstances in ways.
But, Jerry, to respond to that, to us, nothing is just that, no thing. But to God, there is no thing that he can, I'm assuming you meant to say can know. He knows what the no thing or nothing is. But my argument would be, if God exists, though, then that means something exists, unless he is the only way for nothing to exist. But that would just mean that nothing is really God's existence. Well, that's how I'm like figuring it out in my head. I don't know. Because if God exists, something exists.
Which will change us and change us in different ways. We don't choose to change. We are changed by circumstance and by the sort of person circumstances prior to this turned us into. Absolutely.
So go ahead, Dan.
I want to return to Tom Wolfe. He says, I'm wired wrong. And ask what it would be to be wired right. I think most of us are wired right. Not perfectly, but good enough. And the ones that are wired wrong, indeed, they're not responsible. But we deal with the edge cases. That's a delicate and difficult matter. And where the edges are may change over time. But we've still got a normal population of adult, civilized human beings who can be held responsible, who want to be held responsible, and who therefore have, in the sense that matters, free will.
And one could respond to the want to be held responsible with all sorts of sound bites along the lines of loving their chains. We're not trying to explain the brains that are wrong. We're trying to explain all the brains, and this applies just as much. The brains that are wrong are the easier ones for us to figure out because, yeah, this person, fetal alcohol syndrome or abused as a child, yeah, those are the easy ones. And that's the liberals' edge case version of, yeah, let's remember those are the exceptions. They aren't exceptions. That's just a different domain of us trying to figure out how we became who we are, and out of circumstances we had no control over.
Well, what I can tell you is that the circumstance which the listeners had no control over, listening to the pair of you, is that now 49% still believe in free will, and 61% have decided that it's all been determined for them by listening to the pair of you.
Wait, watch it there, fella. 49 and 61 don't add up.
Oh, sorry, yes, sorry.
Click me there.
You're right. But I was told that there's been a 10% swing towards determinism. Sorry if I got the numbers wrong.
That's wild. Isn't that crazy? This video's about over, but I was surprised that there was a 10% upswing of the audience believing in determinism after that debate. I thought Dennet killed it. I think Sapolsky made some good arguments, but ultimately I just don't think you can find determinism to be true. I don't know. I think I'm gonna do. Let me see. There's like a minute left.
So I'm not sure. Yeah, sorry, 39%. Certain other questions come in, and we don't have time. But Dan, Robert, thank you so much for coming to talk to us. I'm not sure that anyone will have changed their mind or understand very much indeed.
So thank you.
Been good talking with you, Robert.
Likewise, this was totally fun. So thank you for this happening.
Thank you both.
Aw. I love a happy ending to a good debate like that. Okay. I'm gonna play one more. I don't know if we'll get through it all. So this one's a little different. This one I haven't watched. So I do think if that one person is still here, what was their name? I think it started with a J. Jacob, maybe? Jacob something. This video is 5 years old, so just a warning. Old news alert. But this is Daniel Dennet again versus Keith Ward, and Keith Ward is a Christian. So this will have a little bit more to do with theology. So yeah, let's start this. Might not finish it. Maybe we will if we get through it. We'll see. It's not too long anyways.
Who couldn't have done it? And that's
of Divinity at Oxford University, and he's presently professor at Roehampton University. His books include Why There Almost Certainly Is a God and More Than Matter. And Keith holds to an idealist view of the mind, believing that consciousness is the primary reality upon which the material world is dependent, and that our existence as conscious, self-aware creatures is dependent on an ultimate mind, God. So Keith and Daniel, welcome along to the program. Great
delighted
to
be here.
We're going to be talking about consciousness, the mind, free will, huge topics, and we won't be able to do them full justice in the course of the time we have today. But perhaps before we get into it, a little introduction to you both. Dan, are you happy to wear the label atheist? Is that something you've called yourself for a long time?
I'm happy to wear the label. For years I didn't bother, but then it seemed that, especially in the United States, there was a sort of theocratic boom. And it seemed important just to tell people, you don't have to make a big deal of it. Just say, no, I'm an atheist, and you know a lot of atheists. A lot of Americans need to hear that.
And in that sense, do you find that your atheism guides you in a specific way, or is it a specific outlook on life in any way, that atheism?
It's just the naturalist outlook. I mean, I don't believe in anything supernatural. And so take on the burden of explaining all the wonderful things in the world in terms that are purely scientifically natural. Acceptable. And
does that for you equate then to a naturalist perspective, being that all that ultimately does exist is material stuff, matter, energy, and so on?
And so on. Yes. Information exists. It's not in a special medium. It always has to be in some physical medium. But you really have to consider information in your theory. And this has been recognized by people, say, in physics for many years. Norbert Wiener put it very clearly. It's impossible to be a modern materialist without adding information to your list. It's neither matter nor energy.
And when it comes to the philosophy of mind, do you find that by and large a naturalist perspective is the dominant one these days when it comes to explaining consciousness?
certainly in the areas that I work in cognitive science and naturalistic philosophy of mind, it's entirely dominant. There is a sort of backwater movement which has got some adherents, which is pushing non-naturalist lines. Panpsychism and dualism of various sorts are currently being enthusiastically explored by a few people.
Well, I'm looking forward to the conversation with you, and I think it's the first time you've met Keith and been able to have a dialogue. So I'm really pleased to be able to bring you both together. Keith, I think you're one of the foremost people probably in the world when it comes to an idealist perspective on consciousness and mind. We'll get you to explain that in a bit more detail in a moment. But you yourself are a Christian. Is that unusual in the world of philosophy, in your experience, to be a Christian?
Well, I'm part of the backwater. In England, it's not really unusual, although I think most philosophers who teach in universities in England aren't very interested in religion. That'd be true, but on the whole they're not very interested in large-scale metaphysical views at all, so they do different things. And there are quite a number of quite notable philosophers who...
I'm going to disappear for a second, but I'm still here and listening.
...who are either religious or specifically Christian. Yes, my colleague Richard Swinburne is one example, but there are others. So it's quite a large backwater, but it's probably a minority. Well, it is a minority, yes.
I think you've both been involved in philosophy of mind for a similar length of time. In fact, I think you both shared a teacher in the past, Gilbert Ryle.
That's true.
Who, as far as I'm aware, Keith, was more in line with Dan's view on the nature of mind than yours.
Well, I don't think he was in line with either of our views, as I understand them, because he was very much influenced by someone called J.L. Austin, who is associated with ordinary language philosophy. And I think Gilbert Ryle always said to me that he didn't have to know anything about psychology at all.
That's true, and he didn't.
But he was just in the use of the words that people use about he's intelligent or he knows something, he has dreams. He was interested in the uses of language. And I think, well, I was certainly more metaphysically minded. I wanted to say what's stuff made of, ultimately. Yes. And he didn't think that was a very interesting question.
Well, let's explore your sort of area and your worldview, if you like, in this sense, Keith, of what stuff is ultimately made of. You're an idealist. Could you explain what an idealist is?
Yes, a lot of people think an idealist is somebody who has rather impractical moral ideals, but it's not that at all. It is saying that consciousness or mind is the best known, most immediately known, and probably ontologically prior, that is, the thing which exists in its own sake, and that the material world is, in some sense, a logical construction out of that consciousness. Interestingly, the person I think we both came across when we were in Oxford, A.J. Ayer, was an idealist in this sense. He thought that what the stuff of reality is what he called sense data, which are perceptions, really. And perceptions are conscious things. And so the British empiricist tradition was always to say in the 18th century that all knowledge comes from experience, and experience.
Okay, sorry. I don't know why my headphones stopped working, but
experience is conscious experience. So that's where I start from, that very old British tradition, really.
And that's, I suppose, in a sense, it's true that everything we do know of is mediated by our senses. Yes. There's a sense in which we are absolutely bound by sight, taste, touch, and everything else. And is that the sense in which you would say that consciousness is primary, is that we are ultimately, our experience of everything has to be mediated by consciousness?
Yes, there are two main philosophical approaches to this. One is phenomenology, which is mostly in continental Europe, and that is you start philosophy by asking the question, what is it like to
I see your book recommendation, thank you. I will write it down in my notes.
Experience something, or what's the nature of experience? So you're starting from experience, and you would probably never say that you could eliminate that. That's a starting point. And then you ask, what is it like to fear? What is it like to have anxiety? Or, the whole of existentialist philosophy starts there. And then there's a rather different empiricist tradition, which concentrates on sense perceptions, but doesn't assume that sense perceptions come through the body. Right, see, and philosophers carry out thought experiments. Could you have visual perceptions and oral perceptions without a body? Could they exist? And people like me we think it's logically possible, and so that's a sort of key move. And you say, if you start from experience and you're not going to eliminate it, then your problem is, what is the material universe? Well, it's not the other way around. It's not.
So it's almost exactly the opposite way around, in a sense, to the view that Dan takes, that consciousness and mental stuff is dependent on, if you like, material stuff. Right. Yours is the view quite the opposite, that the consciousness and mental activity comes first, and that is
it certainly comes first in the order of knowledge, right. And then there's a question, well, does that mean it comes first in real fact? And a person who is an idealist would say, yes, that's certainly a possibility, and it's
We'll come into talking about why you believe this is the case, but how does this all for you point back to God ultimately then?
Well, it's slightly independent. I mean, a lot of idealists wouldn't use the word God because God has a personal sense about it. And so the philosophy of idealism and its major proponents like Immanuel Kant and Hegel wouldn't be God in the sense in which Christians talk about God. It would be something rather more abstract, more metaphysical, really.
Right.
But I would use the word God, of course. So my Christian faith is more dependent on various sorts of personal experience than on philosophy.
Okay.
But they have a natural affinity.
Yes.
If you believe in God, it's fairly natural to say, oh, that fits into a view of saying consciousness is a primary element of reality.
And in that sense, is everything that exists in your view, in some sense, exists because it exists within the consciousness of God at that level?
Yes. And as a hypothesis, I would say it has to do that. There has to be some consciousness. Yeah, that's the hypothesis.
Thank you very much for helping us to understand the idealist perspective. In what sense, then, could you lay out, Dan, your view as a naturalist of how mind emerges from material stuff and natural stuff?
In fact, Keith's account of idealism provides a very nice background for saying what the difference is. He says that sense experience, conscious experience, comes first in the order of knowledge. And I said, first in one sense, you have to be awake and have experiences to start learning about science. But when you do, what you discover is that not only do your senses deceive you, but sometimes you are wrong about your very own experience. You're not the authoritative, infallible, internal witness that you think you are. And if you want to understand science, and I think an idealist has two choices. They can either just ignore science, the material science, physical science, or they can somehow couch it within their idealistic framework, but and then take it very seriously. But if you do that, it undermines your idealist foundations in a sometimes spectacular ways. And what we're learning is that our own experience, the experience that we have untutored and just by being awake, the experience that is first in knowledge, according to Keith, turns out to depend on unbelievably complex and fascinating and sophisticated unconscious computations that go on in our brain. So the naturalist says, well, let's study that. Let's see if we can figure out how brains work. And either you have to deny that brains have anything to do with consciousness, or you have to take that seriously. And when you do, you begin to discover that consciousness, the consciousness that we all enjoy, is not what we thought it was. It's not an inner show at all. It's a way of being in the world and of being knowledgeable and adroit and adept in the world. And the models that we're developing in cognitive science can account for vast stretches of that capacity, and better than we can. If I ask you, just tell me what you see right now, and you say, well, I see your face and I see your nose and so forth. How do you do that? How does your lips move? Something in your brain gets you talking. You have no access yourself to how you framed that sentence and how you relied on your current experience. It just seems obvious, but in fact, there's a lot going on inside there that we have to untangle. And when we do that from the naturalist point of view, the idealist position looks fundamentally backward. It looks like just grabbing the wrong end of the stick.
I'll let Keith respond to that in a moment's time. But what I'm hearing from you there, Dan, is that because we have been able to investigate the material stuff of the brain and see the connections and see that when we do things to the brain, it changes the perceptions people have and their conscious experience and everything else, that gives us evidence that all of that consciousness is strictly dependent on the physical state of the brain in that sense. I mean, nonetheless, it is an extraordinary organ, isn't it, the brain? And when you consider that on a naturalist perspective even, inanimate atoms have come to reflect upon themselves. It is an extraordinary thing, consciousness.
Absolutely is.
In that sense, do you feel that there's still an element of mystery there, or are you happy to say, no, I think we really can, ultimately?
I think we really can. It's a puzzle.
Yeah.
And it's what I call the hard question, not the hard problem, but the hard question. The hard question is, and then what happens? That is, all right, you've got this analysis of information coming in from the senses, for instance, and then what happens? There's a whole story to be told about how we use it, how it modifies our beliefs and our emotions and our memories and our personalities and what we say next and what our projects are. And mostly, even scientists have sort of stopped when they've stopped at consciousness as if that was the finish line. No, that's not the finish line. That's only halfway through. And we have to do, and then what happens? And only when we can explain how consciousness not only moves our bodies and gets our lips moving and so forth, but feeds back on itself and permits us to reflect and reflect and reflect and reflect and reflect. And it's only when you've got an account of the actual brain mechanisms that make this incredible reflective capacity available, then you're really beginning to explain consciousness.
Keith, as an idealist then, what's your problem with this particular account of the way that the material brain can quite satisfactorily account for all of our conscious states and that sort of thing?
Well, first of all, to begin with, I absolutely think it's important to take scientific knowledge about the brain and about the world seriously, and I do want to do that. I don't want to include that in some preordained idealist picture, but I want to understand how it is that the physical structures of the brain interact with consciousness. Having said that, I don't either think that we have infallible knowledge of what's going on in our minds' consciousness, and I agree that a lot of what we're conscious of is caused by the brain. And if something's wrong with your brain, then typically something's wrong with what you understand your consciousness to be. So it's not an infallible thing, consciousness, but I think it is a thing in the broadest sense. That is, if you made a list of the items that exist in the universe, and you had electrons and quarks and superstrings and whatever, and brains, of course, you would also have to add and consciousness, because I'm not convinced that a study of the brain will ever answer the question how consciousness originates. I don't see how that could be done, because you could say, well, when a brain of some sort.
Well, we can't say a no, but we do know only so much about the brain, and I don't think it's all that much. So eventually, science might be able to explain consciousness, but I do agree with him. At this current point, I'm not totally convinced that consciousness can be explained by material matter in our brains, but I also feel like that at the same time is convincing, just not totally convincing yet, since there's no science or evidence of that specifically right now.
Or is in a certain configuration, then consciousness occurs. That seems to me to be a causal relationship, which is contingent. It could have been different.
Just explain that a bit more. What's the problem with the idea of consciousness arising by a particular, combination of neurochemicals?
Well, because a combination of neurons and chemicals is exactly that, and you could know all about that and not know about there being any consciousness. I mean, take an example which appeals to me about an ant. Right? Think of an ant and say, is an ant conscious? Well, I really think we don't know. I don't think ants are conscious personally, but I really don't know. Now, if I ask that question, I'm asking whether there is something about an ant that physical inspection cannot decide.
It's 1, 2, 3, 4, guys. If you, I'm pretty sure I think this has happened at least 2 other times on stream, but I see the clock. I catch the clock at like 1, 2, 3, 4, 12:34, like every single day for like years now. I don't set alarms for it. I don't wait for it. I just look at the clock and I'm like, oh shit. This time, to be fair, I did catch it at 12:33 this time. I just looked up. It's not as crazy, but yeah, happy 1, 2, 3, 4.
Right. I don't think any physical inspection of an ant will tell you whether it's conscious. Right. That's how it seems.
It's something you can only experience directly yourself.
That's a problem for an idealist, that you can't ever experience directly anybody else's consciousness. But I do think that I experience directly my own consciousness, and that I know when I'm aware of something, not infallibly, but at least I know when I'm aware. And I think that's something additional to any physical description of what's happening in my brain.
It sounds a bit like what Keith's describing there, I could be wrong, is something along the lines of the hard problem of consciousness.
It is.
Dan, do you want to explain what that is and what your response to it is, why you don't think it's a problem?
The philosopher David Chalmers dubbed something the hard problem, capital H, capital P, and it's just the problem that Keith outlined. That is, what is there in addition to the adroitness of the ant, which for David doesn't settle anything, is it conscious? And how do we tell the difference between a zombie, which is just as animated as Keith there, but for all we know isn't conscious? And I think this is a subtle trick, sort of like a magician's trick, which gets our imaginations off on the wrong foot. I don't think there is a hard problem. It's just Chalmers' baptism of this hard problem, which has got people convinced there's a hard problem. When he first introduced it, I said, this is just vitalism
There's always next week.
reborn. After all, there's the hard problem of whether something's alive. How do we know the ant's alive? You say, well, look at it. Well, that doesn't prove it. It might just be a robot. I mean, maybe it's a zombie ant, or maybe it's not even alive. Now, physicists, biologists, they don't argue about this. The line between living and not living is not an interesting theoretical line. We've learned, well, are proteins alive? Are motor proteins alive, or are they just little robots? Cells are alive? Yeah. How about viruses? Don't ask. We understand that the complexity gradually creates things which are manifestly alive. Amoebas are alive.
And we don't have to create a strict cutoff at which pinpoint life.
And there's no élan vital. There's no extra substance that you have to put in there that distinguishes the living from the unliving, as many people thought. Those were the vitalists. And I think that Chalmers and Keith here on his own expression, they're remaking the vitalist mistake, and now they simply moved up a notch and they say there's an extra soupçon of something, which is consciousness, which has nothing, and Chalmers is very clear about this, has nothing to do with all the things that I study about consciousness. It has nothing to do with the ability to answer questions or to have your memory adjusted or to change your beliefs or become, get converted religiously. All of those things, those are the easy problems of consciousness. The only problem that's left over is whether you're conscious. And in that sense, it looks exactly like vitalism. And when I put it to David that that's what it is, he said, no, it isn't. The problems are entirely different. And
well, we don't have David here, but we do have Keith. So Keith, what do you make of the way that Dan has laid out the hard problem of consciousness there, and for you?
Well, I don't think vitalism is a problem of any sort. I mean, because as far as I can see, to describe a thing as living is to talk about its reproductive capacities and its behavioral capacities, and that's okay. And I think you can have a very shady boundary in deciding whether you call a bacterium alive or not. But consciousness is not like that. It's not a decision about whether to call something conscious or not. It's a real fact. You want to know, do ants have feelings? And a feeling is something that I know. I have feelings. I started life as a musician, so to me music is very important, and music is consciously perceived. I mean, if it wasn't consciously perceived, I wouldn't be interested in it, right? So whatever is going on in my brain to produce me enjoying music, that doesn't explain my enjoyment of the music. That's an inner experience that nobody else can share. And how I think of Wagner's Ring is totally different from the way that some other people think of it. But it's the same experience. The same things are happening. The same electrochemical wavelengths are going along, and that same neurons are firing, perhaps.
And is it the case that, in your view, the fact that you could look at a person's brain when they're listening to Wagner and say, oh, I can see neurons firing and brain chemistry going on, but that cannot be equated with the same thing as the experience of hearing music?
Exactly. It can't. It's not an identity. There's no identity between finding blood flow in the brain or electrical activity in the brain and whatever it is that they're enjoying when they enjoy a piece of music.
In that sense, it's a qualitative difference.
It's a qualitative difference, and also one which is, it's not like vitalism, because it's not. In vitalism, there's nothing extra which makes something alive. You describe it by describing the biological facts. But I do think that with consciousness, there is something extra. And there could be a zombie. I mean, there could be a person just like me, but wasn't conscious. And I think it probably could be. Somebody could make one. And you get the same problem with a robot. If you made a robot which you couldn't tell the difference in this famous Turing test, you couldn't tell the difference between it and a human being, there would still be a question which you couldn't resolve. Is it actually having experiences? And you wouldn't be able to answer that question.
And this is a live discussion, obviously, with the advent of artificial intelligence and so on.
It is, yes.
But
I was just about to say that's kind of what we're reaching right now with AI and stuff.
But ultimately, when it comes down to it, the fact that you think you cannot equate a brain state with the actual experience of listening to Wagner or seeing the colour red or whatever it might be, means that for you, this consciousness is something qualitatively different from the material.
Well, it's not only that, you see. It's not just a hypothetical thing. It's that what makes my life worthwhile is my conscious experiences and how I cope with them. And my brain, I go along with whatever people tell me about my brain, and that might be very important, but it's not what I'm primarily concerned with. Right? I'd be fascinated to know what happens in my brain when I listen to Wagner, but what I'm primarily concerned with is how meaningful it is to me and the difference it makes to my life. And that is something no physicist could ever tell me.
But then, you should be interested in asking the hard question, and then what happens? So the music is very meaningful to you. So now there's lots of things going on in your brain which are, in fact, embodying that very meaningfulness, that very responsiveness, the fact that it makes a difference. And here, if we look at cases of brain damage, we see people who have locked-in syndrome or who are in a comatose or vegetative state, and there's all sorts of different varieties of this if you read Adrian Owen's wonderful book on this. And here's a question for you. Suppose you were in one of those terrible states, and you're listening to Wagner. And if you're really in a deep coma, then I think you would say, well, then I'm not conscious, of course, and it doesn't matter what's happening in my brain. I'm not enjoying it even. All right, so now we raise the level a bit and raise the level a bit. And this is analogous to moving on up through from proteins to the cells and to the ant and so forth. And at some point, no, not at some point that we can point to with a sharp line, we're going to see a gradual accrual of the very things you're talking about. The responsiveness, the meaningfulness, how it makes your life worth living. Something can't make your life worth living unless it has an effect on your brain. It just can't. And if you understood those, then you would see that there was no charmed line where this something extra got added. There's just more and more of making your life worth living. And there are almost...
I think I see his argument here. I think it's a good argument too for atheism, which I'm not an atheist though, but I do think this is a good argument for it, in that kind of like somebody just wrote, I think it was without lies, Islam dies, just wrote, the fact is the human body is the single most complex thing in the entire known universe. It's absolutely miraculous, all life. And while I agree, and that is one of my kind of like, I don't know, you could call it motivations, one of my drives behind why I do have this intuition that there is some kind of like purpose or meaning to life, is because it does seem so miraculous. Like, just the amount of coincidences and processes and time, and just instances and everything that it took to get to where we are right now does seem so miraculous. But I guess the argument is that, you know, it just, from a human perspective, it seems miraculous. It's a lot to take in. We don't understand it all, so it's pretty like you get like awestruck. But ultimately, it does have an explanation, mostly, not completely though. And so these feelings that we get of, like, you know, the beauty of life and the joys of life and the purpose or the meaning of life and stuff, could boil down to just mere survival, you know, like wanting to live and wanting to procreate and exist in order to survive and continue the species. But my whole point is, what's behind that drive? Why does evolution and just, you know, the life force design our brains and our bodies to have these feelings of wanting to live, and beyond that, like, experience love and purpose and the pursuit of knowledge and everything? What is behind that drive of evolution and survival and progress? And I think that is, in my opinion, where I start to think some kind of meaning, like deeper meaning, or some others may call it God, exists.
Well, certainly are states that you could be in. For instance, your loved ones might say, play Wagner through headphones into his ears. This will give him solace. And they may not be able to tell now whether this is giving you solace, but if they could read your brainwaves, they might be able to say, yes, see, look at these are the reactions of a person who can enjoy, who is thrilled by the music, even though he can't talk, even though he can. And so there's every imaginable variant from dead comatose to wide awake thrilled. And at no point does a special extra thing called consciousness come into it.
Well, I'm not at all happy about that. I agree that, of course, there are different degrees of consciousness. I agree also that the brain works and solves problems and things when you're not conscious. I mean, I agree with that. So I agree there is a causal connection between the brain. I mean, in my view, the brain does exist. Right? I'm not an idealist who says there's no brain. That's right. And the brain gives you access. And if it's working normally, it will give you the access that we call full consciousness. If it's unusual in some way, then that affects the quality of consciousness. So I see this as an access. The brain is an access machine to consciousness. So to put this quite bluntly, if somebody suffers from Alzheimer's, then their memories are not retrievable by the brain. The brain has no access to those memories. But I actually think those memories continue to exist,
That is
but not in the
wild.
physical brain. That's my view. Yes.
Why do you think that's such a, why do you disagree so strongly with that view, Dan?
Well, Keith talks about the brain.
Oh, just to clarify, the without's comment is wild. Sometimes I skim back, I go back through these, and I notice I'm replying or reacting to the comment section or the chat, but if you're just watching the video and you're not reading the chat, it just appears that I'm reacting to the actual video on the the video. So I just want to clarify that.
Brain gives you access. Who's this you? You are your living brain. Close enough. There's no extra Cartesian race cogitans that has access through the pineal to some parts of some things going on in the brain. What access has to mean in a naturalistic context is that, in effect, some parts of the brain have information that is retrievable by them, usable, that modulates their behavior or not. And these access relations are being mapped out very clearly these days. There's still some major puzzles, but when you talk about Alzheimer's, for instance, we can talk about the gradual dissolution of paths of access that are normally there and that play very important roles. But there's never a place where we say, and here's where the access to you as an ego, as an inner witness comes into the picture. That is the image which is deeply ingrained in our way of thinking. And it's just time to learn how to describe it.
As far as you're concerned, then, that idea of personal identity is an illusion. We are simply the accumulated product of our brain states in that sense, if we're anything.
It's not an illusion in the sense that there isn't a continuing Keith and a continuing Justin, but it is an illusion if you think that there's a sort of an essential nugget, which is you, which just happens to be in this body or just happens to be in that body. That idea, which is a very familiar idea from religions.
Theologically, we might call this the soul. And you've written on the concept of the soul. So what's your view on this
I'm
idea?
all for the soul. I mean, all in favor. And this moves on to a second level. The first level of discussion really was whether there are things like perceptions and thoughts and feelings, which you might say could exist, as in Buddhism or as in David Hume, perhaps, as a series of somehow linked perceptions, thoughts and feelings. And so you've got this without a selfless series. And then, so the second stage is say, well, is there anything that holds this series together? And I do believe, and idealists and dualists too, though I'm not a dualist, but idealists and dualists both think you have to talk about not just a series of experiences.
Okay, so I just want to respond to this. So Harry wrote, "We know it's bad to inflict pain on others for the purpose of increasing suffering in the world, but not why we ought not to do it." But that is the reason not to do it. We understand that why is that? I don't get why that's not a sufficient reason not ought to cause pain without a greater purpose, like fixing getting stitches or something like that hurts. You're causing someone pain, but it's ultimately to heal them. But causing pain for the sake of pain, we ought not to do, because it increases pain and suffering. Why is that not a good enough reason? Because the only other argument is, I guess your argument would be because God said so, because God said not to. It's circular. We know it's bad to inflict pain on others for the purpose of increasing suffering. We shouldn't cause pain because I said it, because it causes pain. But like, I don't know, how is that any better than saying we shouldn't cause pain because God said it's wrong to inflict pain? Isn't that the same though? Something is bad because God said it's bad. Isn't that kind of the same thing? It's just that, for my argument, it's based on the human experience and perspective. And from your argument, it's based on God's word, which we get from humans that wrote it. I don't know if you guys want to try to explain that to me. That's just where I'm struggling with the whole morality thing.
Is not infallibly known and not necessarily all connected together.
But I also don't think, I keep thinking about this more too. I think morals are partially, well, I guess if they're partially subjective, like, I think there are moral objectives, but within that, there's still, like, subjectivity, like how we talked about before. If a person is about to kill 10 innocent people, is it morally wrong to kill that one person who you are 100% certain is going to kill those 10 innocent people? Or at least they're threatening to, and they have the means to do it, and it's, a dire situation. Is it morally wrong to kill that one person and save those 10 innocent people's lives? I would say no. But killing is still, like, wrong, but there's subjectivity to that situation. So that's where I'm at with morality.
But there is something which enables that to be known as a series. So my experiences are the things I remember, the things I look forward to. And again, to take an example from music, if I hear the last chord of a Beethoven symphony, I hear it as the last chord of a symphony, which is very different from just having an experience of a chord. So memory is linked somehow, and this is a great problem for people in some Buddhist schools who think of the self as a chain of experiences. And you have to say, well, then there must be something which is a subject, and here it is, a subject of experience. So experiences are possessed by something. Now, I think Daniel might say the brain, or part of the brain, and I think, no, it's nothing physical. See, that's the point. So I wouldn't call this supernatural, but it's not physical. So it's supranatural, that is to say. It doesn't come within the...
those 10 people are innocent by the matters of they're not causing any threat or harm to the person who is threatening to kill them. So, it's not, this person isn't threatening to kill these 10 people in self-defense. They are innocent in this situation. They're not a part, like, they're not causing any justifiable reason for somebody to kill them.
The physical realm of public verification.
And the subject that is experiencing and remembering and looking forward to, this is the immaterial me, in a sense.
Yes, it is. It is not a material thing.
It cannot simply be the brain that is
not
having
the
the subject.
So I strongly don't believe that I am my brain. I think my brain is part of me. I do think that. And I do think I'm essentially embodied, right? Nevertheless, I do think I am.
When you say innocent implies the opposite of evil, I understand what you're saying to a degree, but I feel like in this situation, when we talk about innocent, I'm implying innocent in, like, the eyes of not even, like, the law, but I don't even want to say, like, crime, but yeah, like crime or harm. You're in this again, it's like, to this specific situation, this subjective situation, these people are innocent in, like, they're not causing any potential threat or harm to this person who is threatening to kill them. So it's not justified. Like, innocence in the sense of justice. That's what I mean. Yeah. That's the implication of innocent when I use it there.
And you're having, and we can't avoid this language of I and you and me.
No,
it's deeply embedded, as you say, Dan.
Yeah.
But nonetheless, you think we're wrong to sort of assume that there is a ghost in the machine, as it were.
There isn't a ghost in the machine. What there is information. And information that is organized and that uses memory and anticipation to organize that information. And that can be considered to be the sort of software that's running on the brain. And when you learn a new language, you greatly enhance your competences, your talents, and your proclivities and everything else. This is like downloading another app to your
hardware.
Smartphone.
Yeah,
Yes.
right.
Now the brain's a hardware, but the organization of the brain is the software, and that what we can do as human beings depends very much on the software that we've downloaded through culture, on our language and on all our reading and the tricks that we've learned and the tools that we've learned how to use. All of that has to be embodied in the brain, but it's information. It can be passed from person to person, doesn't weigh anything. It's like poetry.
But sticking with this computer analogy, I guess when I use a computer, I can see the hardware and I know what the software does and the way it processes everything. But there still has to be a me that it means anything to. It won't mean anything to the computer. It's just a lot
You're
of
the user
information.
of the computer. Yes.
Yeah.
Now, who's the user? Who's the user of the brain? And the answer is the brain. The brain consciousness is the brain's user illusion of itself, and it needs it.
With the trolley car situation, I mean, sure, you can say consequentialism doesn't always account for additional information, but religion doesn't in that situation either. Like, what would your objective morality be for that person in the trolley car scenario to do? What would God tell that person to do? Just not act at all?
It needs it in order to simplify the task. The brain is too complicated in its myriad details, and the world is too complicated for the brain to deal adroitly with it. So the brain has been designed to have user interfaces inside it that simplify it, so that it makes things easy to track, easy to deal with, easy to recall. In the same way that the screen on your laptop makes, you don't want to know the complexities of what are going on inside your computer.
Oh, and I just want to... No, God wouldn't be in that position. I'm talking about, so the trolley car situation, though, I'm pretty sure it's like a thought. I just read it. I just Googled it because Harry mentioned it. It's like a thought experiment where if one person, if there's a trolley car, I'm just going to call it a fucking train. Okay, there's a train on a track, and I guess the track splits, and on one side of the tracks there's 5 people, and on the other side is 1 person. So the train, you have the power to divert the train to hit either hit and kill 5 people or hit and kill 1 person. And so consequentialism would say to divert the train to hit and kill the 1 person. But the argument against that is, well, what if the 1 person is like a super good person who like has the cure to cancer, and the 5 people are like full of like a couple like rapists and really bad people or whatever. So how can you make that decision? So my argument, or my question is, what would religion tell that person in the trolley car scenario to do? Divert it to the 5 people, to the 1 person, or just not divert it at all? And I'm just asking because I don't know. I'm curious. Okay. I'm gonna keep going. Actually, no, yeah, I'll keep going.
So you have this very handy, very effective user interface, so-called user illusion. And that's what consciousness is. It's a user illusion that is designed by evolution and by learning and by cultural evolution to make our brains
useful,
capable,
in a sense, yeah,
of getting our bodies through this complicated world.
Yes, I mean, see, at that point, I have to say that what you call an illusion is, to me, the most important thing there is. And
I'm even going to give you that. This is Wilfrid Seller's concept of the manifest image. There's the scientific world of quarks and protons and atoms and molecules and so forth. And then there's the manifest image, the world of people and tables and chairs and music and songs and faces and beliefs and promises and all that good stuff. That's the most important level. And all of that, the very existence, the very fact that we have these categories, is due to this brilliant summarization and extraction of important details from this booming confusion of atoms that is described by the scientific image.
Yeah. Well, my sense of the importance of my experience would be vastly undermined if I thought it was really all completely caused by a booming conglomeration of atoms.
Why?
Well, because that has no purpose.
That's right.
The laws of physics are completely purposeless. They just operate.
Okay, wait. Objective morality via a moral and just God would be a priori understanding, I don't know if I pronounced that right, that murder is wrong and wouldn't result in a consequentialist choice to begin with. No, hold on. And then Jerry said, God would know you were trying to pin him in a position where there was no good answer and he couldn't be involved. It's against his nature. No, I understand, but what I'm saying is, in this thought experiment, if you guys say that God gives objective morality, then what are you, as a Christian, morally inclined to do in that situation of the trolley car experiment? As a human, not as God, as a human. So Harry brought this up because he said consequentialism doesn't account for, what exactly did he say? If blah blah, there would be a priori justification, but consequentialism doesn't always account for additional information. Example, the trolley car experiment. So consequentialism doesn't always account for additional information, which I agree. So I'm just asking, what would a Christian choose in that situation if morals are objective in Christianity? It's not about well, I'm not saying what religion would tell a person. I'm just saying, you guys say that religion has objective morality. So what is the morals in that situation? What is morally right to do in that situation?
Operate in accordance with whatever principles of regularity there are. So you lose the notion of purpose, really. Purpose is part of the illusion of in your inner experience you have purposes, but actually the brain doesn't. So if you're going to say this is produced by the brain, then you're really saying, well, the reality is not purposive.
Okay, so there is no morally right thing to do, only more wrong. And isn't that consequentialism? Like, the consequences of killing 5 people is worse than killing 1. And again, morally, it's not really on you. You're not killing them, right? You're actually, and your intent is to try to save people. So you're actually, instead of killing 5 people versus killing 1 person, the question is more, are you morally inclined to save 5 people or save 1 person? And consequentialism would say you're morally inclined to save the 5 people. But as Harry pointed out, it doesn't account for the fact that we don't know who the individuals are. But that's just the nature of, like, it's not totally perfect, but what I'm saying is, I don't think religion gives a better answer to the trolley car experiment either. Oh, I think it's a bad faith question too, but I just looked it up. Harry just pointed it out to me because he was saying consequentialism doesn't account for that. And what I'm saying is that Christianity doesn't account for those situations either.
If you just think you have purposes.
Well, no. In fact, that's, in some ways, the main theme of my latest book, From Bacteria to Bach and Back, because one of the central philosophical themes in that book is showing how a purposeless process, natural selection, in a purposeless physical world gradually creates purposes, and how we have.
Okay, but I'm just saying, like what would, if morals are objective, according to you, because God means that there's objective morality, then what would the person in the trolley cart experiment, what ought they do? Based on Christianity ideology, Christian ideology.
Purposes. Our tools have purposes, our limbs have purposes, our eyes have purposes. Nature is.
I'm just saying, I think you come across the same exact problem, but that's why I'm asking, because I'm not Christian. So I'm just asking if there's a solution to the trolley cart scenario in Christianity that consequentialism doesn't offer.
awash in purposes. They're not generated from the top down by the great purpose giver, God. They emerge from the bottom up from a purposeless process. That's the genius of Darwin's idea.
Also, and there is absolutely 100% no obligation to this at all, but I was wondering if anybody would be interested in, because I know we like do a lot of these discussions like in the chat and stuff, and I was thinking of doing in the future maybe like an open panel, and if you guys would want to come up here and actually talk and have a conversation, you don't have to show your face or anything. You would have to, like, backstage, just show me, and then I'll bring you on, but your face wouldn't be in the video, just to make sure, because lots of people do, like, fucky shit, and I've seen it on other channels, they bring people on without, you know, confirming behind screen first, and then they show a penis or something fucked up on screen. So, but I was wondering if anybody would ever be interested in that in the future, so we could have these discussions like on a live. Yeah, and you don't have to show your face; it could just be audio. So I was just wondering, because if anybody would be interested in that, I was thinking about setting that up. I would have to stream from a different stream thing, but that's no big deal. So, and there's no obligation. Nobody, if you guys just want to keep talking in the chat, I enjoy this too. So, okay, cool. All right, awesome. Yeah, I'll plan to set that up in the near future.
Right. Well, I think that's a heroic project.
It is.
It is, but I don't think it's a possible one. And
Tell us why.
Well, because purpose. If you think of something philosophers call intentionality, what you're thinking of there is you have an idea in your mind, and you're going to say write a book next year, and so you think you have an idea in your mind of writing a book next year, but this idea refers to something that's future. It's not something that's actually present.
And again, your face wouldn't show on the actual video in the stream. It would be like, it would be backstage before you come up. You just show me you're a person, just super quick, on off, camera on off, and then you can come up. And your face would not appear in the video at all. Only I would be able to see it for like a quick second.
You don't give a complete description of the idea by just describing what's actually in your mind at the moment, right? Because it has to refer to the future, okay? And it's very difficult, I think, for a materialist or a naturalist to say what it is about physical processes which don't refer to the future, because how could they? What would that mean? The concept of something in your present behavior being determined by the thought of something which doesn't exist in the future, and the purpose is you trying to get that. So the idea looks, as to the common sense, as though your idea is having a causal effect, but it's your idea of the future having a causal effect. And I don't think a physical description can cope with that idea, which is about it's the aboutness. It's I know you.
I mean, I know that you we'll come back to you in a moment then, but from your point of view, Keith, what I'm hearing is that the idea of purpose has to have a reality to it that it simply can't have.
Yes,
on a purely physical explanation.
Well, even Daniel says it emerges, but it says a purpose emerges from a non-purposive background, and I think it's such a different concept. It's the idea of causation by an idea of the future, which is very different from causation by being pushed from the past. Right.
And what other problems for you emerge when we, as it were, do away with your concept of personal identity? Because I mean, this might be a good point at which to start talking about free will and moral agency and that sort of thing.
Oh, perfect. Okay, now they're going to start to get into free will and. We'll say, okay, let's just see.
Well, along with purpose, the other thing that correlates with it is the idea of value. Now, at this point, again, we might have a disagreement here, because I do think that one of the important things about human life is that there are values which we don't invent. So that's a basic philosophical option, I think, that you say values are objective in the sense that some things really are worthwhile and of value, even if nobody thinks they are. and that in thinking of a moral value, you ought to be charitable, for example. That is true. I think that's a moral truth, and you can discover that it's true. You ought to be charitable. It's not something you decide or invent, and so that's another basic philosophical. It's an option, really. But if you go for the option of there being objective values, that correlates with purposes, because your purpose is to achieve something of value. So they go together, purpose and value. And I can't see that they would enter into any physical description of the brain or of anything else.
And so in that sense, this value that you believe exists independently of, our brain states or anything else.
I'm not, the word independently, I mean, it's obviously not, there is that causal connection. But
it's objective, as you say.
But it's objective. I think, I would believe, and I think, again, it's not decidable neutrally, but I would believe.
I think I tend to agree with that thought field. Cool name, by the way. Subjective versus objective might be inappropriate for moral evaluations. I think I can tend to agree with that, because I struggle with that too. Because I don't think there's necessarily objective morality, but it's not really subjective either.
Believe that there are moral obligations on people, whether or not they think there are. And that is a truth about the universe.
And can this only make sense in when we're talking about a personal identity, the idea that we are a person who has exists through time and is not in a sense just a
value is not part of a physical catalogue of things, and it correlates with a purpose. Your purpose is to obtain something of value, so that correlates with agency, and that correlates with the idea of a subject self, which is other than just a stream of experiences, which was actually aimed to produce values. All those things connect together.
I think this will take us into the whole area as well of determinism and free will and so on.
Well, can I just respond?
But please do respond.
To Keith's
yes,
line about purpose. What he's adopting is, I think, quite clearly a sort of top-down theory of purpose. He doesn't think it can bubble up from purposeless processes, the way Darwin and people who are Darwinians like me would say. And he says he doesn't see how this future-looking purpose could ever be accounted for in terms of something like the Darwinian purpose, the Darwinian process. You should learn about Bayesian predictive coding. It's the big bandwagon in cognitive neuroscience right now, which is precisely how the brain is always anticipating, projecting, forming hypotheses, in effect, about what's going to happen next, and then checking those hypotheses against the data coming in. This is how our brains get the adroitness and the real-time capacity that they do. They're designed to look ahead. They're designed by Darwinian processes to anticipate the future based on the experience of the past. And since the future isn't always just like the past, they make mistakes. But they are also designed for those very mistakes to feed back into the system and correct those mistakes. So the brain operates as a generator of anticipations which are then tested against the world, and it's a constantly revising, sort of a moving target about trying to get the immediate future right. And then, of course, that in turn permits us to have long-range goals in the future. Another thing you said, Keith, is you thought there were values that were not, as it were, human-made, because human beings maybe didn't even realize that they had these values. But there's no reason why something that is ultimately a human construction, a human artifact, can't have surprises in it. The game of chess is certainly a human construct, and yet people are still learning things that you can and can't do in chess. So there's plenty of discovery in even something as simple as chess. And the idea that the moral code that we have evolved over the last, let's say, 50,000 years, that it's been changed, it's been improved. No help from religion there, by the way. Religion has dragged its feet along the way. All the improvements from Old Testament morality today have been hard won by rational argument and largely fought by the churches. But we've learned better than that old morality. We've constantly improved our sense of morality, and that can go on in the future, and we may learn.
Doesn't the word improve suggest there is some objective standard to which we are heading?
Oh, yes, and in the same way that when they, to keep it very simple, I want to deliberately have a simple example. When they added the castling rule to chess, they improved the game of chess. Why? Well, because people, who are the chess players, found the game sort of too slow if you didn't have this move. It just made the game more wonderful, more interesting. And similarly, there are practices which were not only condoned, but even required in Old Testament morality, which we completely shun today. We would never dream of behaving that way.
Well,
can I just
few things to
take
respond to
chess?
there. Yeah.
Well, because computers can play chess very well, of course, and they could beat me any time. Deep Blue could beat me any day of the week. But I don't think a computer would say, well, I play chess because it's more interesting and it gives me a sense of, whatever, imaginative
That's right, but
creativity. Well, so I don't think computers would play chess unless they were made to. I mean, people play chess for fun. And that's not something that machines do. They don't do things for fun. And so not yet. Well, I think here what you're doing is taking a bet on the future. You're saying, I bet that brain science will develop in such a way that it will show that all these things can be done perfectly well by a machine. And I suppose my bet is that that's not going to happen. And that you could get a zombie which acted like a robot, like a human being, but still felt and experienced nothing and didn't get thrilled by things that were happening or invent new moves because they were exciting.
It would just appear to be thrilled.
It would just appear to be.
And it would guide its life by its being thrilled by this.
Yes, but that still wouldn't be the same.
Okay. Just wanted to make sure that your zombie was indistinguishable from a normal conscious human being.
It's externally and publicly indistinguishable.
Good, okay.
But internally it is distinguishable. That you'd never know because it was probably trained to tell you that it had deep feelings, so you still couldn't tell.
I mean, we're getting into the whole area of artificial intelligence in a sense, but coming back to your view that this objective moral realm exists, and I think...
quick personal story time. One time, I might have told the story before. I don't know if I have. One time years ago with an ex-boyfriend, I was tripping on acid, and I haven't tripped in a couple years now, but I used to trip not all the time, but like maybe once a year when I was like a little younger, maybe a couple times a year. But I'm a shrooms person. I will probably never do acid again. But anyways, I took acid. I took acid a couple of times, but this one time I took it with my boyfriend, and he was a machinist, so he's very into, obviously, machines and stuff. He convinced me I was a robot, and I was programmed to never believe I was a robot. So I couldn't help it, and I would never know because that was my programming. And in the beginning of the trip, I was like, I'm not a fucking robot. Like, shut up. And then the hours are going on, and he fully convinced me I was a fucking robot. And luckily, it freaked me out. It freaked me out for like a little bit, but then I ended up like, being to myself like. Or saying to myself, like, well, if I am a robot, like, life isn't so bad. So even if I am a robot, like, I don't know, it's pretty chill. So I didn't have a bad trip or anything, but it was super trippy. And it was kind of scary for, I don't know, who knows how long of a time. But, yeah, just a funny story.
On Dan's view, well, we can simply explain that by an evolutionary history, which helps us to interact better and so on. And we don't discover these things; they're simply emergent, like everything else.
I don't know who that is, but I always get people telling me I look like somebody, and it's always a different person. So it's usually always a different
in our experience.
person.
And he has critiques, obviously, of religion and the Old Testament in terms of saying, well, we can certainly see that we're better off now with the morality we've developed over the thousands of years.
Of course. I mean, I have to say that I think Jesus had something to do with that improvement, and that we haven't yet managed to live up to any of the things that he said about it. So religion, yes, okay, is a very ambiguous phenomenon, but if the religion is about the person who taught something like the Sermon on the Mount, we've got a pretty improved.
I'm happy to accept that. I think he was a very clever man.
Yeah, and
a very good man.
And a good man.
But not perfect.
So for me, goodness is a quality of the universe. That is to say that, not that the universe is all perfect, I don't mean that. I mean that the obligation to seek goodness is a fact about the universe. And I can't put that into a physicalist account of the universe. I can't see how it would fit. Whereas, well, if I can introduced the word God at last. I think if you had the mind of God or the mind of the Creator, then the obligation to achieve true goodness, not some arbitrary command that God made up, that obligation would fit into a picture of the universe as founded on a morally obliging reality, which would be a mind, and it wouldn't be a brain. I mean, nobody thinks there's a cosmic brain. So I think if you're wanting to rule out the idea of God by definition, by saying, well, there couldn't be such a brain, I agree there couldn't. So that comes down to the question, just as a thought experiment, well, could there not be a mind which did not, like human minds, depend upon the good functioning of a brain? And I don't see why not.
Well, all right, I'll go along with you on that and say, all right, I don't think I can offer an a priori knockdown proof that there couldn't be a disembodied mind, but I don't see how a disembodied mind of God could ground morality at all. Why should we care what a disembodied mind thought we should do? I mean, if I tell you Lucille says that you shouldn't do that, well, who's Lucille?
Right.
And in fact, what could matter more than what we human beings, after careful consideration and in concert, what we decide, this is what's worth living for. Why doesn't that? What could trump that?
Oh, I think God could trump that.
Oh,
if
how?
Lucille was actually perfectly good herself and created us and had a purpose for us which would fulfill everything about our lives, then if Lucille said, do this, we'd say that's probably...
Well, yes, indeed, but that makes Lucille, you've just defined the answer. This is no... you just helped yourself to a problem solver by defining it as a problem solver.
Well, yes, but I didn't make this up. It's been around since the dawn of the human race. Well, yes, but the idea of God is like the idea of quantum reality. Somebody made it up, but that doesn't mean that it's not true.
Let's move on to free will. We need to, because we really must touch on this before we have to close our conversation. Now, would you describe yourself as a determinist, Dan?
I think I know you guys are not going to agree, but I like that argument from Dennet there.
Yes, in all that matters. I mean, I'm happy to go along with the physicists that say that there's quantum indeterminacy, but I don't think it makes any difference for free will.
And determinism is essentially the view that everything can be explained by the previous states of things, and that in a sense...
No, carefully. You have to say that very carefully, because there's explanation, then there's explanation. Flip a coin, a fair coin. Nobody can predict whether it's going to come down heads or tails. Nobody can predict it, not because it's quantum unpredictable, but because the forces acting on that coin involve the position of electrons at the edge of the visible universe. It's just beyond calculation. Now, that's an epistemic point.
But if you could, in theory...
But the coin will be a random flip all the same. So is it an undetermined coin flip? No. Is it a random coin flip? Yes.
But in a sense, if you could, in principle, describe every single force that's acting on that coin,
Laplace, yes,
then you could predict which side it will come down. And in a sense, when it comes to the question of the mind and consciousness and free will, the view that everything is ultimately determined by the physics of the universe means that a lot of people have a question mark over what that does for us. The fact that we think of ourselves as free agents, moral agents, even the very act of reasoning and having conversations. If it's all in a sense being determined, there's a real question that arises of can we make sense of anything then if in fact everything we do, say, think, feel has at some level been decided a long time ago by the physical attributes of the universe simply rolling out in a predetermined way. So you're a compatibilist, though, when it comes to your view of free will. Perhaps you'd like to explain how you come to terms with this question around free will and determinism from a compatibilist point of view.
Yeah. The notion of freedom that is incompatible with determinism is not the notion of freedom that matters. The notion of freedom that matters is the engineering notion of freedom, the notion of degrees of freedom. Right now, you have many degrees of freedom. There are lots of different ways in which you can move your parts and move your...
I like that. Degrees of freedom. I think that is a good way to sum up what I was trying to say earlier, in like all those outside factors that factor into our decision making, and some of which do limit some people sometimes. So I think an easier way of saying that is what he just said, which is calling it degrees of freedom or degrees of free will.
Lips and so on. It has nothing to do with determinism. And what we want to do is look at which systems in the world are autonomous and which systems in the world are in fact being controlled heteronomously by some other controller. And if I have a drone and I've got the little box, I'm in control.
I don't think self-interest is indistinguishable from self-centeredness. I think I can distinguish between the two, especially because, like, for example, a mother would have the self-interest of taking care of her, or an expecting mother would have the self-interest of taking care of herself for a child. For actually a better example, a person, let's say me, when I was addicted to drugs, getting clean is a self-interest, right? But that's not self-centeredness. So I think I can distinguish between the two.
Well, that drone, it is not autonomous. Its activities are being determined by me. They're being controlled by me. However, I may be able to throw a switch, which makes it autonomous. It is no longer in my control, and it is then no longer in the control of anything else except itself. It's the causes raining down on it, and the gravity and the wind and all the rest of that. Those, let us suppose, they've been determined since time immemorial. It doesn't matter. An autonomous system can be designed to deal with those. In fact, it depends on the reliability, on the predictability of all of those forces. And to some degree, it samples those in order to improve its control over the situation. Now, what we want to be as free agents is we want to be autonomous. We don't want somebody else pulling our strings. I have a little cartoon of a puppet that's making its legs move by pulling strings on its legs. That's what we are. We are self-controllers. And it's really a bad trick of the imagination to think that if determinism is true, then nature is pulling our strings. Because nature is not an agent. Nature doesn't care. Nature doesn't have foresight about what it wants us to do.
So there's a sense in which then we have freedom in the sense that
Unless it does.
that's meaningful for us.
Absolutely.
But if we simply were able in some way to rewind the clock 30 seconds, would we have exactly the same conversation with exactly the same words, with exactly the same movements? Because that is what would have had to have happened in a sense. Are we determined in that sense?
If we could rewind the clock perfectly, yes. But that's not interesting. There's a famous footnote in J.L. Austin's work where he talks about lining up a putt on the putting green. And he strikes it and he misses it. And he says, well, but I could have made it. And he says, and this does not depend on anything like if I tried harder or something like that. On that very occasion, with exactly that situation, I could have made it. And then he says a very important thing. He says, and experiments could prove that out. Well, what? Quantum mechanical experiments? No, clearly what he has in mind is he could line up the putt 10 times in a row, right there, and his friend says, well, let's see. And sure enough, 8 out of 10 times he makes it. But those precisely aren't the same occasions. But that's what matters. What matters is the robustness of our abilities. If you could make that putt under different circumstances, highly reliably, then there's a sense in which you could have done it otherwise. And if not, then you couldn't have done it. And that's the sense that matters, and it is neutral with regard to determinism.
You're not a determinist, are you, Keith?
No, I'm a libertarian in this respect, which means that in exactly the same situation, at least two different alternative futures are possible.
So if you rewound the clock, and did the putt again under exactly the same conditions,
you might get a different outcome.
You could get, in theory, get a different outcome.
Why would that make a difference?
Well, it wouldn't as such make a difference, but if you thought that you have an alternative set of futures and that it's under your control which one of those happens, that makes a difference.
Yes, but I believe that.
No, you don't say that, because you say if you perfectly rewound it.
Well, but you can't do that.
No, you can't do that. No.
But I mean, it's
a thought experiment, obviously. But I think your view is, Keith, and as a libertarian, when it comes to free will, you believe we do have genuine free will.
Yes. I think one of the rules in English law, and I think in American law too, is that you can only be guilty of something if you could have done otherwise. Now, that's precisely the J.L. Austin quote you use. But I think lawyers would interpret this to mean at that time, he didn't have to do the things he did. Nothing made him, not even himself, He didn't make himself do that. He should not have done it. He did what he should not have done. Now that's the problem that people like me would struggle with. Is guilt attributable to what people do?
Because if there's a sense in which people are determined at some level by their physical chemistry or their previous brain states or just the physics of the universe, there's a sense in which they cannot be culpable for doing things wrong if they were bound to do those things.
If somebody said to me, and people have believed this, that God sends people to hell, but he's created them in order to send them to hell, I would feel morally affronted by that. But my moral affront would be based on the fact that if people do go to hell, it must be their own choice and not God's choice. So now you do have somebody pulling the strings. It's not just nature. On this sort of view, there is a personal being who's doing that to you, and you feel affronted that that being should not have done that. And I think a libertarian would say, and of course God's not like that anyway, but people should not do the things they do. And there is also the David Hume point that actually determinism it's just unprovable. You can't show that everything has to happen the way it does.
Unfortunately for the libertarian, if a free choice really involves the conditions you say, then how could you be responsible? Because you can't determine which choice you make. That is, all of your previous education, suppose...
Does not determine it.
Does not determine. In other words, I assume that you've been raised to be a very moral and non-violent man.
Non-violent, yes.
And if we were to hand you a gun right now, and I were to suggest to you, well, why don't you shoot Justin in the arm? I'm not going to get...
Thank you. We won't demonstrate this practically.
Why don't you just to prove you have free will, shoot him in the arm. Now,
I might surprise you.
You might, but you won't. And you won't because you know better. And your prior experience makes this, I'd bet, very, very large sums of money. You're not going to do it. And it's going to be a free choice. And you just better hope that it's not an undetermined choice, because if it were, then you might suddenly find yourself doing it in spite of all of your previous...
My view is not that you would find yourself doing it, but that you could decide to do it, which is very different.
I think they both agree here. I think they both believe in free will, or at least, Dennet is a compatibilist. And then, what's his name? Keith Ward is a libertarianism? Libertarian? Oh my god, I can't fucking talk. I'm getting tired. Libertarian, but it's like not libertarianism. It's like a different one that has to do with determinism and stuff. So, but I feel like they're agreeing. I think they're just disagreeing on like where the free will comes from. Ward probably thinks it has to do with like God gave us free will, and then Dennet probably believes that free will just comes innately in humans from nature.
Well, who's the you that's doing this deciding?
Well, I've got a you. You see, you might not have a you, but you've just got a brain. I've got a you. So I've got a the subject self, which
exactly,
is the soul in Christian terms, is also an agent self. So it has a certain agency which it decides between courses of action. So it is not determined by its past behavior. Now, in the case, I would not actually shoot Justin, but there are things I would do to Justin if you ask me to. And
I'm feeling worried here, but yeah, carry on.
Well, and I might decide, and some of them I might, well, for example, if you say, could you inflate how much it costs you to get here by train and so make a bit of money on the side? Well, I might have a realistic
you might not be the most moral person. You might
I might not be as moral as you think I am. So I might say, well, I decide to do this. And it would be, nothing in my past would make it the case that I was going to decide in a particular way. I would at that moment make a decision.
I mean, when Dan says, well, the fact that you were brought up to be a moral person and you've got a good education and so on, for you, those aren't determining things. Those, not even if they strongly
influencing
the way that you do lead your life, but they're not, in a sense, determined.
Influence. That was a word that I used in my thoughts notes about this too. Is that these external factors influence our decisions, but do not predetermine them.
The
That's
outcomes.
true, though I agree with a generally Aristotelian view that habit actually constrains virtue, so that if you have learned to always be honest in your life, there's a better chance you'll continue to do an honest thing. But nevertheless, there are tipping points, and when people are put in crisis situations, as they can be, then I think at that point...
So I think the type of determinism we're talking about is different as far as Keith's concerned. It's not a hard determinism in the sense of the type of physical determinism that perhaps you believe ultimately governs everything, Dan. If Keith has been raised in a moral environment, that's an influence rather than a determining factor of how he will behave.
Well,
he could still do otherwise.
Yes, and if he did otherwise, we'd want to know what determined him to do otherwise.
Well, I'd say just decided.
I agree, Thoughtfield.
Well, but a decision can't happen without something happening in the brain, and either that thing that happened in the brain was undetermined, was a quantum event of some sort that was really, it was an amplification of a quantum event, or it wasn't. And quite frankly, I don't see why it makes any difference. One way I've put this, I've said, suppose, you're really going to hate this example, Keith. I give you 2 robot babysitters. These are going to take care of your grandchildren, so you really care about whether they're any good. Robot A is deterministic,
right,
but has a random number generator which it uses all the time to get itself out of Buridan's ass situations in its calculations, and it's wonderfully caring and adroit and foreseeing, and it's really expert.
Carl Johnson, Calvinism says free will doesn't exist. It's all about predestination. Is that so? So is that a like fundamental disagreement between Catholics and Protestants? Is free will, or am I confusing something?
At caring for grandchildren.
Caring for grandchildren. Robot B has exactly the same software running on exactly the same hardware, but instead of having a pseudo-random number generator, it has genuine radian randomness in it, so that there is a sense in which it is undetermined while the behavior of A is determined. Now, tell me, if you had to entrust the lives of your grandchildren to one of these, would you have any reason to prefer robot B over robot A?
You'd prefer A, but that's because
why?
B is governed by randomness, and I don't want people to be random.
Well, if it's undetermined, then it's random.
No, it's not. I think one should use the expression sufficiently determined, and if something is sufficiently determined, then if you have this set of causes, you are bound to have this effect. But I think it could be not sufficiently determined, and I think a person... Morality, this is where...
Oh, okay. Oh. Calvinism. Okay.
Morality becomes very important for me, that people are guided by whether they're going to do something because it's right or not. And
what's a Calvinist then?
If you could make a robot which could consider moral questions.
Oh, both A and B do that.
Do they?
Oh yeah.
Sorry, is that just another like sect of Christianity, or is that separate from Protestants? I'm not even going to try to say the word, but...
Yeah.
That's what I doubt. I doubt if a robot could consider the morality of an issue. And if it did, I would treat it as a person.
I mean...
So would I, if it could.
Apart from the moral issue, for me, one of the interesting questions that the idea of determinism raises is whether we can speak of reason and rationality.
Yes.
Now, you're an atheist, Dan, but if all our past events are physically determined at some level, isn't your decision to be an atheist simply an accumulation of those past events?
Thank
and you
you
haven't, in a sense, decided to be an atheist. You are simply the product of
But what
a
kind
set
of an
determined
accumulation is it? It is one that's been accomplished by machinery that has been designed by evolution over billions of years to do a very good job of telling truth from falsehood and of not drawing unlicensed conclusions. Think of an eagle for a moment. The eagle's eye, very high fidelity, very high accuracy. It is a brilliant truth discoverer about the things that matter to eagles, and then it puts them to great use. We have wonderful senses too, and we can, but not only do we rely on them, we have learned how to improve on them in hundreds of ways. We have eyeglasses and telescopes and microscopes and all sorts of scientific devices and methods, truth-seeking methods. Now, it's undeniable that we use those, not perfectly, but my decision to be an atheist is a product of that whole development of truth-seeking processes, and that's why it is.
But Keith,
something.
Keith is also the benefactor of all of those same processes down through the millennia,
Yep.
and he's chosen to be a Christian.
Yep.
So in some sense, isn't ultimately, if everything is ultimately determined, that you were going to be here and have this conversation, if you were around the clock perfectly, it would all happen in exactly the same way. Isn't your decision to be an atheist and Keith's decision to be a Christian ultimately simply a factor of that? There's no ultimate sense in which we've freely chosen anything in our life. And therefore, can we even speak of the reasons and the truth-seeking and so on that we value? Maybe
there's an ultimate sense of freedom in which neither Keith nor I nor you are free, but that's not one that cuts any ice when it comes to the question of whether we have reasons.
What do you think about this, Keith?
I think reasoning is difficult. Indeed, I think it's impossible to account for in purely physical terms, because to try and think about something, decide whether or not it's true, if you have a hard problem of some sort, that is not like handing it over to your brain to solve. It's like doing some really hard thinking. And that's the problem. That seems to be a directed process, that there is a you, which is, and I don't think it's just the brain, not the physical brain. You use a brain. So this is what it comes down to. I think the person, the self, the soul, uses the brain, and if the brain's not operating properly, it will probably come up with the wrong answer. But if the brain is operating properly, it still has freedom. In fact, that's what the brain exists for. So I think the soul is very dependent on the brain, and I don't deny that at all.
I don't deny it either.
Right.
Well, you deny a soul, though, obviously.
No, in fact, I was interviewed once by an Italian journalist, and the headline in the Corriere della Sera the next day was, "Sì, abbiamo un'anima, ma è fatta di tanti piccoli robot." Yes, we have a soul, but it's made of lots of tiny robots. And that's it. That's right. I mean, we do have a soul. A colleague of mine wrote a book with the, I think, very bad title, "My Brain Made Me Do It." Well, what else would you want to make you do it? As you, I mean,
and why
you wouldn't want somebody else's brain?
Why isn't it ultimately your brain that made you do it? In your view?
Because I think I use my brain. I mean, I think
there's a me using the brain.
You are a dualist.
Well, that's such a dirty word. But yes, I do believe there is something other than the brain which ultimately makes human choices and finds human meaning and has human purposes. Yes, I do. And of course, millions of people think that reality, that self, can exist without the physical brain, because when you die, you've obviously got no physical brain left. And belief in immortality, I don't think, is an impossible belief. Let me put it at its minimum. I think it is possible to exist without this brain and this body. And
so do I.
But then you can't be a materialist and think that.
No, that's the information.
The information could be put into something else.
If the information in my brain were perfectly encoded, and this brain died, it could be uploaded, and I would go right on.
It would still have to exist in some physical material.
It would have to exist in some physical medium.
Yeah.
Well, of course, at that point, you have to ask what you mean by physical, because now that we have dark energy and dark matter and
it has nothing to do with dark energy.
It has something to do with it, because you say, by physical, do you mean something in this space and time, having these dimensions and mass, etc.?
Yes.
Well, perhaps not. Perhaps if you can download it into a piece of silicon, perhaps you could download it into dark matter or something.
Well, probably you could, but that wouldn't. But
we don't know. I mean,
I think one of the things we know about robots that makes them profoundly unlike moral agents is that they are potentially immortal. Because
is it popular for Christians to believe in ghosts? Like, I know Catholicism obviously has a long history with like exorcisms and stuff. Is that primarily retaining? I'm sorry, I'm getting sleepy. Is that primarily regarding like demons and like those types of entities, or do they believe in ghosts as well? Because that's a thought I've had before, is kind of what this Ward guy is saying here, is that I've pondered the idea of our souls being able to exist without a physical body. Again, I have no like concrete belief in or disbelief of it, but it's just something I've thought about definitely being possible.
You can download all the software.
You can just keep uploading it into fresh hardware.
Upload, you can back them up and then reboot them. And that's a sort of immortality. And that's a sort of
information without any.
You got to have it on a hard drive.
And I don't even know if I would say, after you die or whatever like that, your body is transferred into some kind of like dark matter or something. Well, I don't even know what that is, but I would consider it, I would guess, and my intuition would tell me that it would be an energy. It would be a different form of energy.
You got to have
on
it
a
on
hard drive.
But the point, look, this is a really important moral point. I think you should.
No, I wasn't expecting Caspers, even though that would be so cool. I would love a pet-friendly ghost named Casper. Honestly, that'd be so cool.
You should never sign a contract with a robot. Because, where it's acting on its own, not as a surrogate for somebody else. Because robots aren't people. They aren't fragile. They aren't mortal like us. They can just be rebooted the next day. You can't threaten to punish a robot. You can't extract an or else.
But
when a robot makes a promise, you'd be a fool to accept it.
But you do see, didn't you just say that we could be rebooted as well, in principle?
I did.
Yeah.
Yes. So you see, I was agreeing with you with a certain sort of immortality in a purely material
way. There's a form of immortality, digital immortality, in a sense that could in principle be possible.
I think it's preposterously
even that, though,
impossible,
would be,
in fact.
Yeah, I think it's impossible. So you have Beethoven symphonies on digital things with strings of noughts and ones, and you say, well, there's the information for Beethoven. Right. So Beethoven's symphony is immortal. Well, you'd need to have the kit to turn it into something that somebody could hear before it was Beethoven's symphony.
Which brings us back to where we started. Why don't we wrap this up, gentlemen? Because I could go on chatting to you both all day, but time is against us. I just wonder at the end of the day whether both of your worldviews that you come to this area with obviously are going to influence the conclusions you make. So, Keith, you're a theist ultimately. You're an idealist. And you interpret, in a sense, the world through that lens, through the idea that there is ultimate purpose, there is ultimate, value, and that explanations cannot simply be physical, but there can be, in a sense, purposive explanations for the things we do and that kind of thing. So, in a sense, you're bound to impose then on the physical world that you do obviously recognise is there, that element, that theistic way of looking at life, that is full of purpose and kind of a metaphysical view of reality.
Well, that's right. When you say impose, that sounds rather brutal, but that's the way I think things are.
Well, it's the filter through which you naturally...
It's the filter through which I see things, yes.
That is, in a sense, what a worldview is. So, and when you see what Dan does, do you equally see that he has a naturalistic filter by which he then, presumably, in your view, reduces all of that stuff to the
and I think
stuff?
These are both highly defensible philosophical views, which is why I don't think philosophy answers our ultimate questions.
You don't think the idealist view is obviously as defensible as your naturalist view?
I think there's a certain gratuitous mystery about it. And the things that Keith thinks are, and had better remain, mysterious, can in fact be accounted for quite adequately in a naturalistic framework. We can make sense of purpose. We can make sense of beauty, joy, love, promising, death, the urge for immortality. All of these things have naturalistic accounts. And when we've given them, it doesn't diminish the wonderfulness of life or the wonderfulness of people at all.
I just like to ask one question. Do you regard this as work in progress, yet to be done, to complete this program?
Oh, sure.
Yes, yes.
In that sense, do you have faith in the naturalistic project that it will ultimately describe everything?
Faith in the same sense I have faith in engineers to make bridges that in general won't fall down. That's why I don't tremble with fear when I cross a bridge. It's a faith based on evidence.
And many people do accuse a naturalist sort of perspective as being reductionistic, because ultimately beauty, truth, love is all ultimately reducible to chemicals.
Reducible is just a bad word here. There are levels and levels and levels of explanation. And you can't explain dollars, to take something very mundane. You can't explain the economic value of a dollar or a pound using atoms and electrons. That's just the wrong level at which to explain it. That doesn't mean that there's anything, as it were, metaphysically irreducible about dollars. It just means that if you want to explain them, you go to an appropriate level to explain it.
And for you, when it comes to explanation, ultimately you find that you're more satisfied with a view that goes beyond the naturalist view?
I think for me, the most important kind of explanation is
Caught myself. I was muted again. Caught myself early. It's funny you say that about the conversation with Jordan Peterson and Alex O'Connor. I found him this past week while I was doing research into these debates of the existence of God. He also has a couple videos on free will. He is he doesn't believe in free will. He's a determinalist. I don't know if that's the word for that, but he believes in determinism. He does not believe in free will, but I tend to agree with him on a lot of other things. I haven't caught his conversation with Jordan Peterson yet. I caught some of it, just a small amount. I think it was kind of long. But that's something I want to get around to watching soon too. But I just found him. I think he's pretty cool. But yeah, this is over. I'm getting very sleepy, so I'm gonna go. But thank you all for being here and discussing. I think we had some good conversations tonight, and I always appreciate the back and forth interactions and conversation. I called into the Atheist Experience once and spoke to Matt Delonte. His name has come up across a bunch too while researching all this and looking for debates. Of course, he ended up just calling me a jackass and hung up on me. What else is new? I guess I'll have to watch one of his debates too. I think I started watching one or even two, but for some reason I didn't stick with it. So, good night. Okay, we got one final joke. Why did an atheist chicken walk across the road to prove he didn't need faith to get to the other side?
Riches again.
Boom. I wish I have a soundboard thing. I gotta get it set up. All right. Good night, everyone. Thank you. I'll see you next time. And good night.